The Battle Cry of Freedom. The Civil War Era. Chapter 1: The Road to War. The path to the Civil War was shaped by decades of growing tensions between the North and South. These tensions stemmed from deep ideological differences over slavery, state rights, and the future of the nation. The institution of slavery was at the heart of these debates. In the South, the economy relied heavily on agriculture, especially cotton, which was farmed by enslaved people. The North, on the other hand, had a more industrial economy and was largely opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. These differences created an atmosphere of distrust, as both regions feared that the other would impose its will on the nation. One of the earliest signs of the division came with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which was an attempt to balance the power between free and slave states. The compromise allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine entered as a free state, preserving the balance. It also established the 36 degrees 30 feet parallel as the dividing line between future free and slave territories. However, the Missouri Compromise was only a temporary solution, and as the nation expanded westward, the question of whether new states would permit slavery became more pressing. In the 1850s, the debate over slavery in the territories reached a boiling point. The Compromise of 1850 was passed in an effort to calm tensions, allowing California to join the Union as a free state and implementing a stricter Fugitive Slave Act that required citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. The compromise also allowed the residents of new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery through a concept known as popular sovereignty. This was seen as a way to avoid a direct confrontation between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, but it only intensified the conflict. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 further inflamed tensions. Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived in free territories, sued for his freedom, arguing that he should be free because he had lived in places where slavery was illegal. The Supreme Court, however, ruled against him, stating that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be citizens of the United States. The ruling also declared that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise. This decision outraged many in the North, who saw it as a further attempt to expand slavery. In addition to legal decisions, the rise of abolitionist movements played a critical role in the lead-up to war. Prominent abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison pushed for the immediate end of slavery. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852 exposed the brutal realities of slavery to a wide audience and further divided the nation. At the same time, pro-slavery advocates in the South were equally vocal, defending slavery as a necessary institution. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 marked the tipping point. Lincoln, a member of the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. His victory was viewed as a direct threat to the South, and within weeks, Southern states began to secede from the Union. The South feared that Lincoln's presidency would lead to the abolition of slavery, which they believed was vital to their way of life. These actions set the stage for the secession of the Southern states and the beginning of the Civil War. The road to war was not a sudden event, but the culmination of decades of political, economic, and social divisions. Each decision, compromise, and court ruling added fuel to the fire, ultimately leading to a nation divided by its core beliefs. The tensions that had simmered for so long were now on the brink of eruption, and the United States stood on the precipice of war. The debate over slavery. The debate over slavery was one of the most divisive issues in American history, shaping the nation's political, social, and economic landscape. At the core of the conflict was the question of whether slavery should be allowed to expand into new territories and states. The institution of slavery had existed in the American South since colonial times, where it played a central role in the economy, particularly in agriculture. The Southern economy was heavily reliant on the labor of enslaved people, who worked on large plantations growing crops like tobacco, rice, and cotton. In contrast, the North's economy was more industrial, and many in the region believed that slavery was morally wrong and should be abolished. By the early 19th century, tensions over slavery began to intensify as the United States expanded westward. The question of whether new states and territories should permit slavery became a central issue in American politics. This led to a series of political compromises and conflicts that attempted to address the issue, but ultimately deepened the divide between the North and South. One of the first attempts to address the expansion of slavery was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The compromise was crafted to maintain the balance of power between free and slave states as the nation expanded westward. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, while Maine was admitted as a free state. The compromise also established a line across the Louisiana Territory, north of which slavery would be prohibited, with the exception of Missouri. While the Missouri Compromise temporarily eased tensions, it did not resolve the underlying issue, as the nation continued to grow and new territories and states were added. In the 1850s, the debate over slavery reached a new level of intensity. The Compromise of 1850, which included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, was an effort to settle the question of slavery in the newly acquired territories following the Mexican-American War. The act required that runaway slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had escaped to free states. This law angered many in the North, who felt it was an infringement on their rights and a moral wrong. The compromise also allowed residents of new territories like Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery through the concept of popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 further escalated the debate. This law repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide whether to allow slavery through popular sovereignty. The result was violent conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in Kansas, a period known as Bleeding Kansas. The violence highlighted the deepening divide between the North and South, and many feared that the nation was heading towards civil war. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, a Supreme Court ruling, also fueled the debate over slavery. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom, arguing that he had lived in free territories. However, the court ruled against him, stating that African Americans could not be citizens, and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. This decision effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise and allowed for the expansion of slavery into new territories, further angering many in the North. Throughout the debate, the issue of slavery became increasingly entangled with questions of morality, economic interests, and political power. Abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe called for an immediate end to slavery, while many Southerners defended the institution as vital to their economy and way of life. The debate over slavery was not just about economics, but also about deeply held beliefs regarding race, freedom, and the future of the nation. By the time of the election of 1860, the debate over slavery had reached a boiling point. Abraham Lincoln's victory, despite not carrying a single Southern state, was seen as a direct threat to the institution of slavery. The debate over slavery had polarized the nation, and the South, fearing the end of slavery, began to secede from the Union, setting the stage for the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, enacted in 1820, was a pivotal moment in American history, serving as an early attempt to address the growing divide between the North and South over the issue of slavery. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether new territories and states should allow slavery became increasingly contentious. The Missouri Compromise sought to strike a delicate balance between free and slave states, attempting to maintain political equilibrium while satisfying the interests of both sides. However, while it temporarily eased tensions, the compromise also highlighted the deepening divisions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The immediate catalyst for the Missouri Compromise was Missouri's application for statehood. Missouri, located in the western part of the country, sought to join the Union as a slave state, which would upset the balance of power between the free and slave states. At the time, the Senate had an equal number of free and slave states, and the addition of another slave state would tip the balance in favor of the South. Northern politicians, many of whom were opposed to the expansion of slavery, feared that allowing Missouri to join as a slave state would pave the way for the spread of slavery into other territories. This fear was particularly heightened after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which had added vast new territories to the United States, raising the question of whether slavery would be permitted in these new areas. To resolve the issue, Congress, led by figures such as Henry Clay, crafted a compromise that would admit Missouri as a slave state but also admit Maine as a free state. This would preserve the balance of power in the Senate. Additionally, the compromise established a geographic line across the Louisiana Territory at the 36 degrees 30 feet parallel, with slavery being prohibited north of this line, except in Missouri. This line was meant to serve as a boundary between future free and slave states, with the expectation that new states created in the northern part of the territory would be free, and those in the southern part would allow slavery. The Missouri Compromise was seen as a victory for both sides in the short term. The South gained Missouri as a slave state, while the North secured Maine as a free state. The compromise also temporarily alleviated fears of the further spread of slavery, particularly in the newly acquired territories from the Louisiana Purchase. For a time, the issue of slavery's expansion seemed to be settled, and the nation could focus on other matters. However, the Missouri Compromise was not a permanent solution to the problem of slavery. It simply postponed the inevitable conflict. The compromise made it clear that the issue of slavery would remain a central concern in American politics. It also revealed the deep sectional divisions that existed within the country. While the North and South agreed on the immediate terms of the compromise, they remained fundamentally at odds over the morality and future of slavery. In the years that followed, new territories and states were added to the Union, and each time, the question of whether they would allow slavery reignited the debate. In the 1850s, the Missouri Compromise was effectively nullified by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery through the concept of popular sovereignty. The act led to violence in Kansas and marked a turning point in the growing sectional conflict. The Missouri Compromise, though a temporary solution, proved to be inadequate in addressing the root causes of the division over slavery. Its legacy is a reminder of the challenges the nation faced in reconciling its differing economic, social, and political interests, which ultimately resulted in the Civil War. The Dred Scott Decision. The Dred Scott Decision of 1857 stands as one of the most significant and controversial Supreme Court rulings in American history, deeply affecting the nation's stance on slavery and the rights of African Americans. The case involved Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had been taken by his owner to free territories, including Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory. Scott argued that because he had lived in free areas, he should be granted freedom. The decision, however, not only denied Scott his freedom, but also had far-reaching implications for the nation's understanding of slavery, citizenship, and the power of the federal government. At the core of the case was the question of whether Scott, as an enslaved person, could be considered a citizen of the United States. In a 7-2 ruling, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney and the majority of the court ruled that Dred Scott was not entitled to his freedom and could not sue in federal court because he was not a citizen. The court's decision hinged on the belief that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not considered citizens under the Constitution, and thus had no standing to bring a case to court. This ruling reflected the prevailing view in the South that African Americans were inherently inferior and could not fully participate in American political life. In addition to denying Scott his freedom, the court's decision addressed the broader issue of the expansion of slavery into the territories. The majority opinion declared that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, thereby invalidating the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had attempted to restrict slavery in certain areas of the United States. The decision effectively legalized slavery in all federal territories, opening the door for the institution to spread into regions that had previously been free. This ruling angered many in the North, who saw it as a deliberate attempt by pro-slavery forces to expand slavery's reach across the country. The Dred Scott decision intensified the sectional divide between the North and South, pushing the nation closer to the brink of civil war. In the North, the decision was viewed as an outrageous expansion of slavery's power, and it galvanized anti-slavery activists and abolitionists. The ruling was seen as a betrayal of the principles of liberty and equality that the country had been founded on. Prominent figures such as Abraham Lincoln strongly criticized the decision, arguing that it contradicted the nation's founding ideals and would lead to the further entrenchment of slavery. On the other hand, the decision was hailed by many in the South, where it was seen as a validation of the Southern way of life and the economic system that depended on slavery. Southern leaders celebrated the ruling as a victory, believing it gave them a constitutional right to bring slavery into the new territories. The decision also strengthened the resolve of many Southerners to defend slavery as a positive institution, essential to their economic and social order. The Dred Scott decision had lasting effects on American politics. It further polarized the nation, deepening the divide between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. It also played a key role in the political rise of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. Lincoln's debates with Senator Stephen Douglas in 1858 were largely focused on the implications of the Dred Scott ruling, and Lincoln's firm opposition to the decision helped propel him to the presidency in 1860. Although the decision was a significant victory for pro-slavery forces, it was ultimately overshadowed by the events leading up to the Civil War. In the long run, the ruling did little to resolve the issue of slavery and only highlighted the nation's inability to reconcile its deep-seated divisions. The Dred Scott decision remains a stark reminder of the Supreme Court's role in shaping the nation's history and its involvement in the political struggles of its time. Chapter 2: The Divided Nation. The early decades of the 19th century were marked by growing tensions between the North and South, particularly over the issue of slavery. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether new states and territories should allow slavery became increasingly divisive. The country was rapidly changing, and the balance between free and slave states was becoming harder to maintain. This chapter examines the political, economic, and social factors that contributed to the division of the nation, and the steps that led to the secession of the Southern states and the eventual outbreak of the Civil War. The election of 1860 was a pivotal moment in the story of a divided nation. Abraham Lincoln's victory in that election, despite not carrying a single Southern state, marked a turning point in the nation's history. Lincoln, a member of the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery, was seen by many in the South as a direct threat to their way of life. The South believed that the Republican Party, with Lincoln at the helm, would eventually abolish slavery, which was central to the Southern economy and social structure. The South's fears were not unfounded, as Lincoln's speeches and policies made it clear that he was committed to stopping the spread of slavery into the new territories and states. The election of Lincoln caused an immediate crisis in the South. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, followed by 6 other Southern states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as its president. The secession of these states represented a rejection of the Union and a desire to preserve their own interests, particularly the institution of slavery. The South's decision to secede was based on the belief that they had the right to determine their own future without interference from the federal government. They felt that the North, through its growing political power, was increasingly dictating the terms of the nation and undermining their way of life. The secession of the Southern states was met with strong resistance from the North. Northern leaders, including President Lincoln, rejected the idea of secession and considered it an illegal act. They believed that the Union was perpetual, and that no state had the right to unilaterally leave it. Lincoln's inaugural address made it clear that he would not accept the breakup of the Union and would take measures to preserve the nation. His election and the subsequent secession of Southern states signaled that the nation was heading toward a violent confrontation. As the nation became more divided, the issue of slavery remained the primary point of contention. The North, with its growing industrial economy, had largely moved away from the practice of slavery, although it still existed in some areas. The South, however, was deeply entrenched in the system of slavery, which was seen as essential to its agricultural economy, particularly in the production of cotton. The debate over slavery was further complicated by issues of state rights, with the South arguing that the federal government had no right to interfere with their internal affairs, including the decision to maintain or abolish slavery. By the time Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded from the Union. The question of what to do with the remaining slave states, which had not yet joined the Confederacy, remained unresolved. The nation was on the brink of war, and the events that followed would ultimately shape the future of the United States. The secession of the Southern states and the deep divisions between the North and South made it clear that the country could no longer remain united under its current form. The coming conflict would test the very foundation of the nation and determine whether it would survive as a single, united entity or fracture into separate parts. The election of 1860. The election of 1860 was one of the most significant and consequential elections in American history, serving as the catalyst for the secession of the Southern states and the eventual outbreak of the Civil War. The election took place against the backdrop of a nation deeply divided over the issue of slavery, with tensions between the North and South at their peak. Abraham Lincoln's victory, despite not carrying a single Southern state, marked the tipping point in the sectional conflict that had been brewing for decades. The primary issue in the 1860 election was slavery, particularly its expansion into new territories and states. The North, with its rapidly industrializing economy, was largely opposed to the expansion of slavery, while the South, with its agrarian economy, was heavily reliant on the institution of slavery. The debate had become more intense following the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery through popular sovereignty. This led to violence in Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions fought for control of the territory. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, which ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, further inflamed tensions. The Democratic Party, once the dominant political force in the United States, became deeply divided in 1860. The party held its national convention in Charleston, South Carolina, where delegates from the northern and southern states clashed over the issue of slavery. The southern delegates demanded a platform that protected the rights of slaveholders, while the northern delegates sought to limit the expansion of slavery. When the convention failed to reach a consensus, the Democratic Party split into 2 factions: the Northern Democrats, led by Stephen A. Douglas, who advocated for popular sovereignty, and the Southern Democrats, who nominated John C. Breckinridge and supported the protection of slavery in all territories. The Republican Party, founded in the 1850s as an anti-slavery party, emerged as the main alternative to the divided Democrats. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown former congressman from Illinois, as their candidate. Lincoln's platform was clear. He opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories and advocated for the preservation of the Union. He was not an abolitionist, but he believed that slavery should not spread to new areas and should eventually be phased out. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, emerged as a moderate option, advocating for the preservation of the Union and a compromise on the slavery issue. The party nominated John Bell of Tennessee, who sought to appeal to those who wanted to avoid a confrontation over slavery and maintain the status quo. As the election progressed, the sectional divisions within the country became more pronounced. Lincoln's platform was highly unpopular in the South, where many believed that his election would lead to the abolition of slavery. In fact, Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most Southern states, as the Southern states refused to allow the Republican candidate to run. Despite this, Lincoln's message resonated with voters in the North, where his opposition to the expansion of slavery and his promise to preserve the Union garnered significant support. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln won the election with 180 electoral votes, while his closest rivals, Douglas and Breckinridge, divided the vote in the South. Lincoln's victory was not based on popular vote. He received only about 40% of the popular vote, but his strong showing in the North, where he won nearly every free state, gave him a decisive victory in the Electoral College. His win, without any support from the South, signaled to Southern leaders that they no longer had a voice in the federal government. The election of 1860 had immediate and dramatic consequences. In response to Lincoln's victory, several Southern states, beginning with South Carolina, seceded from the Union, citing their belief that Lincoln's presidency would lead to the end of slavery. These states formed the Confederate States of America, and the stage was set for the Civil War. Lincoln, despite his efforts to reassure the South that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, had become the symbol of a Northern political movement that the South viewed as a direct threat to their way of life. The election of 1860, more than any other event, marked the point of no return for the nation, setting the country on the path to war. The secession of the Southern states. The secession of the Southern states from the Union was one of the defining events that led directly to the outbreak of the Civil War. Triggered by the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, the secession marked a dramatic shift in the political landscape of the United States and set the nation on a path toward war. For the Southern states, secession was seen as the only way to preserve their way of life, particularly the institution of slavery, which was vital to their economy and social structure. However, the decision to secede was not a sudden or isolated event. It was the culmination of decades of tension between the North and South over issues like slavery, states' rights, and economic differences. The election of Lincoln was the immediate cause of secession. Although Lincoln had been clear in his campaign that he did not intend to abolish slavery where it already existed, his opposition to the expansion of slavery into the new territories and states was seen as a direct threat by the Southern states. In the South, slavery was viewed as essential to the agricultural economy, particularly in the production of cotton. Many Southerners feared that the Republican Party, with Lincoln at its head, would eventually take action to abolish slavery entirely. They believed that the federal government, under a Republican president, would no longer respect the rights of Southern states to govern themselves and would impose its will on them. South Carolina was the first state to act. On December 20, 1860, after Lincoln's victory in the presidential election, South Carolina formally declared its secession from the Union. The state's leaders justified their actions by arguing that the Union had become a compact of states, and that since the federal government no longer represented their interests, they had the right to leave. South Carolina's secession was followed by other Southern states, including Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, which also declared their intention to leave the Union. The secession of these states was driven by a combination of factors. One of the key issues was slavery. Southern leaders believed that the abolition of slavery would ruin their economy, which relied heavily on the labor of enslaved people in cotton and tobacco production. They also feared that Lincoln's presidency would lead to the spread of anti-slavery sentiments across the nation, further undermining their economic system. Additionally, the issue of states' rights played a significant role. Southern states argued that the federal government had no right to interfere with their internal affairs, including the practice of slavery. They believed that the power of the federal government had become too centralized, and that they had the right to make their own decisions without outside interference. As the Southern states seceded, they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, CSA, with Jefferson Davis as its president. The Confederacy was established with the goal of creating an independent nation in which slavery would be protected. The new government saw itself as the true defender of the Constitution, believing that the Union had abandoned the principles of states' rights and had become increasingly hostile to the Southern way of life. The Confederacy also sought to preserve its sovereignty and resist what it saw as the Northern aggression of the federal government. In response to secession, President Lincoln and the federal government rejected the idea that any state had the right to leave the Union. Lincoln, in his inaugural address in March 1861, made it clear that he would do everything in his power to preserve the Union. He argued that the Constitution created a perpetual Union, one that could not be broken by individual states. However, the South remained determined, and the situation quickly escalated. The attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861 by Confederate forces marked the beginning of the Civil War. The secession of the Southern states was a pivotal moment in American history. It marked the point at which the nation's political, economic, and social divisions became irreparable. What began as a debate over the expansion of slavery evolved into a full-blown conflict over the survival of the Union. The secession of the Southern states was the first step in the creation of the Confederacy, a new nation dedicated to the preservation of slavery and the protection of states' rights. This decision set the stage for the Civil War, a conflict that would reshape the United States and forever alter its political and social fabric. The formation of the Confederacy. The formation of the Confederacy in 1861 was a direct response to the secession of Southern states from the Union following Abraham Lincoln's election. As the Southern states left the Union, they sought to create a new government that would protect their rights, particularly the institution of slavery, and secure their political and economic autonomy. This new government, known as the Confederate States of America, CSA, was established with the goal of maintaining slavery as the cornerstone of Southern society and ensuring the survival of an agricultural economy that was reliant on enslaved labor. The Confederacy's formation marked a significant shift in American history, leading to the outbreak of the Civil War and fundamentally changing the nation's political landscape. The first state to secede from the Union, South Carolina, led the charge toward the formation of the Confederacy. After its secession on December 20, 1860, South Carolina called for a convention of the Southern states to discuss the possibility of creating a new nation. In response, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed South Carolina's lead and also declared their secession. These states were motivated by a shared desire to protect slavery, which was integral to their economic system, as well as by growing concerns about the North's increasing political power and the perceived threat to Southern way of life posed by Lincoln's presidency. On February 4, 1861, representatives from the 7 seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to create a new government. This convention led to the formation of the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War from Mississippi, elected as the President of the Confederacy. The Confederacy's Constitution closely resembled that of the U.S. Constitution, but with key differences, most notably a stronger emphasis on states' rights and the explicit protection of slavery. The CSA's Constitution enshrined slavery as a fundamental right, guaranteeing its expansion into new territories and prohibiting the government from interfering with the institution. The Confederate Constitution also stressed the sovereignty of individual states, ensuring that each state would have significant autonomy and limiting the central power of the Confederate government. This reflected the Southern belief in states' rights and opposition to the increasing federal authority that had characterized the Union government in the years leading up to the secession. The Confederacy's focus on states' rights and the preservation of slavery set the stage for ongoing conflict, not only with the northern states, but also within the Confederacy itself, as the war unfolded. One of the key motivations behind the formation of the Confederacy was the preservation of the Southern economy, which was deeply tied to slavery. The South's agricultural economy, particularly its cotton industry, was reliant on the forced labor of enslaved people. Southern leaders feared that Lincoln and the Republican Party's anti-slavery stance would ultimately lead to the abolition of slavery, which they saw as essential to their way of life. By forming a separate government, they hoped to create a nation where slavery would be legally protected and could continue to thrive. The Confederacy, however, faced significant challenges from the outset. The federal government in Washington, led by President Lincoln, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Confederacy, insisting that secession was illegal and that the Southern states were still part of the Union. The Confederate government also faced difficulties in establishing its authority. While the seceded states were united in their desire to protect slavery, they had differing views on many issues, and the Confederacy's emphasis on states' rights meant that there was limited cooperation between the states on matters of defense and governance. Despite these challenges, the formation of the Confederacy represented a clear break from the Union, and its creation set the stage for the violent conflict that would erupt in 1861. The Confederacy's commitment to preserving slavery and its defiance of the Union led directly to the Civil War, which would reshape the United States. The Confederacy, though short-lived, left a lasting legacy on American history, and its role in the war would continue to have profound effects on the country's political, social, and racial dynamics for generations to come. Chapter 3: The Outbreak of War. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 was the result of escalating tensions between the North and South, primarily over the issue of slavery and states' rights. Following the secession of several Southern states and the formation of the Confederacy, the United States was on the brink of conflict. Despite efforts to reach a peaceful resolution, the election of Abraham Lincoln and the subsequent actions taken by the Southern states made war almost inevitable. The immediate spark for the war came when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a federal military installation located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Before the attack on Fort Sumter, the federal government under President Lincoln had faced a difficult decision. Lincoln was determined to preserve the Union, but was also committed to avoiding unnecessary conflict. After taking office in March 1861, he faced the challenge of dealing with the seceded Southern states and the newly formed Confederacy. In an effort to prevent further secession and assert the Union's authority, Lincoln sought to resupply Fort Sumter, which was still held by Union forces but was surrounded by Confederate territory. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces, under the command of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, opened fire on the fort. The attack lasted for 34 hours, and by the time the Union garrison surrendered on April 13, the fort had been heavily damaged, but there were no casualties. The attack on Fort Sumter marked the first military engagement of the Civil War, and was a clear act of aggression by the Confederacy. It was a turning point that left Lincoln with no choice but to respond with force. In the wake of the attack, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer troops to suppress the rebellion and restore the Union. The response to Lincoln's call for troops was swift in the North, but in the South it was viewed as an invasion. As a result, 4 more Southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy, further solidifying the division between the North and South. The attack on Fort Sumter unified the North, rallying people behind the Union cause. However, it also ensured that the South would not back down from its decision to secede. With both sides now committed to war, the conflict that had been brewing for years was finally underway. The outbreak of war set the stage for a long and bloody conflict, with both sides believing that their way of life was at stake, and the future of the nation hung in the balance. The attack on Fort Sumter. The attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, marked the official beginning of the American Civil War, setting the stage for a conflict that would reshape the nation. Located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, Fort Sumter was one of the last federal military installations in the South, still under Union control, after several Southern states had seceded from the United States. As tensions escalated between the North and South, the fort became a symbol of the Union's authority in the South, and its fate would ultimately spark the war. After the secession of South Carolina in December 1860, followed by the formation of the Confederate States of America, the federal government found itself in a precarious position. Fort Sumter, though situated within Confederate territory, had a garrison of Union troops who were running low on supplies. President Abraham Lincoln faced a delicate situation. He was committed to preserving the Union, but wanted to avoid provoking unnecessary conflict. Despite pressure from Southern states to abandon the fort, Lincoln decided to send a resupply mission to the fort in early 1861, hoping to reinforce its garrison without escalating tensions. The Confederate government, led by President Jefferson Davis, saw this resupply mission as a direct challenge to its authority. The Confederacy demanded that the Union forces at Fort Sumter surrender. When Union Major Robert Anderson, the commanding officer at the fort, refused to comply, Confederate forces, under the command of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, opened fire on the fort at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours, with Confederate forces using artillery to bombard the fort's defenses. Despite the heavy fire, there were no casualties during the attack. Major Anderson and his troops, though outgunned and outnumbered, held out until April 13, when they were forced to surrender due to the lack of supplies and the fort's extensive damage. The Union troops evacuated the fort, and the Confederacy took control of the strategic military installation. The attack on Fort Sumter, though relatively small in scale, was a clear act of aggression that marked the point of no return for both sides. Lincoln, in response to the attack, called for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to suppress the rebellion and preserve the Union. The attack united the North behind the Union cause and led to the immediate secession of additional Southern states. Meanwhile, in the South, the Confederacy saw the attack as a victory, strengthening their resolve to fight for their independence. The attack on Fort Sumter set the stage for 4 years of brutal conflict, with both sides preparing for what would become the deadliest war in American history. The First Battle of Bull Run. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the First Battle of Manassas, was the first major battle of the American Civil War, and took place on July 21, 1861, in Prince William County, Virginia. The battle marked a significant turning point in the conflict, revealing that the war would not be the quick and easy victory that many had expected. For both the Union and the Confederacy, Bull Run was a painful lesson in the realities of war, demonstrating the scale of the conflict and the challenges that lay ahead. In the early months of the war, both the Union and Confederate armies were poorly trained and inexperienced. The Union, under the leadership of General Irvin McDowell, sought to quickly capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, and end the rebellion. McDowell's plan was to march his army from Washington, D.C., and engage the Confederate forces near Bull Run, a creek located just outside of Manassas. The Union believed that a swift victory would demoralize the South and secure a quick end to the rebellion. On the Confederate side, General Pierre G.T. Beauregard, who had commanded the forces at Fort Sumter, was stationed in Northern Virginia, along with General Joseph E. Johnston, who was reinforcing the Confederate troops. Despite the Confederacy's limited resources, their forces were well positioned and able to resist the Union assault. The Confederate troops were also more familiar with the terrain, giving them a strategic advantage. The battle began in the morning, with an engagement between the two armies. Initially, the Union forces made some progress, pushing back Confederate lines and seeming to have the upper hand. However, as the day wore on, Confederate reinforcements, particularly from General Johnston's forces, arrived and helped to turn the tide of the battle. The Confederates launched a strong counterattack, and the Union troops, unable to maintain their position and morale, began to retreat. The Confederates pursued the retreating Union forces, but the pursuit was disorganized, and the battle ended without a complete Union rout. The outcome of the First Battle of Bull Run was a decisive Confederate victory, and it shattered any illusions that the war would be short and easily won. For the Union, the defeat was a sobering reminder of the strength and resolve of the Confederacy. The loss also led to significant changes in leadership, as President Lincoln replaced McDowell with General George B. McClellan, hoping that a more experienced commander would bring greater success. On the Confederate side, the victory boosted morale and solidified the leadership of General Beauregard and General Robert E. Lee, who would later become one of the most famous commanders of the war. The First Battle of Bull Run set the stage for a long and bloody conflict. Both sides now understood that the war would not be decided quickly, and it would take years of hard-fought battles before either side could claim victory. The battle also had a profound impact on the public perception of the war, as it dispelled the belief that the Union would easily crush the Confederacy, and made it clear that the struggle for the nation's future would be a far more difficult and costly endeavor than anyone had anticipated. The Union's initial strategy. At the onset of the Civil War, the Union faced the difficult task of defeating the Confederacy, a newly formed nation determined to maintain its independence. The Union's initial strategy, often referred to as the Anaconda Plan, was designed to apply pressure on the South in multiple ways, with the goal of strangling the Confederacy economically and militarily. The plan, first proposed by General Winfield Scott in 1861, was a comprehensive approach that aimed to exploit the Union's advantages in manpower, resources, and industry. It was not an immediate all-out assault, but rather a slow and methodical strategy intended to wear down the Confederate states over time. The first component of the Anaconda Plan was a naval blockade of southern ports. The Union's superior navy was tasked with cutting off the South's ability to export cotton, its most valuable commodity, and import necessary supplies, including weapons, ammunition, and other goods. The blockade aimed to disrupt the Confederacy's economy and prevent it from gaining support from foreign nations, particularly Great Britain and France, which had been dependent on Southern cotton. By preventing the South from trading, the Union hoped to weaken the Confederate economy and deprive its military of essential supplies. In addition to the blockade, the Union aimed to gain control of the Mississippi River, which ran through the heart of the Confederacy. By controlling the river, the Union would be able to split the Confederacy in two, severing vital transportation and supply routes. The Union's strategy focused on capturing key Confederate strongholds along the river, such as New Orleans, Vicksburg, and Memphis, to disrupt the South's ability to move troops and supplies across its territory. Control of the Mississippi River would also provide the Union with a strategic advantage, allowing them to dominate the western theater of the war. On land, the Union strategy included a series of offensives aimed at capturing Confederate territory. General McDowell's ill-fated attempt to capture Manassas at the First Battle of Bull Run was an early example of the Union's aggressive efforts, but it also highlighted the challenges of executing such a strategy with an untrained army. In the months following the battle, the Union leadership realized that defeating the Confederacy would require a more organized and sustained effort. The Union strategy shifted toward a more coordinated campaign, involving multiple armies moving in concert to apply pressure on the Confederacy from different directions. While the Anaconda Plan was not without its flaws, it represented a methodical approach to defeating the South by exploiting the Union's strengths. It relied on a combination of naval blockades, territorial conquest, and economic strangulation to bring the Confederacy to its knees. This strategy, however, would take time to implement and required patience, perseverance, and leadership. Early defeats, such as at Bull Run, showed that the Confederacy was more resilient than the Union had anticipated, and the path to victory would be long and costly. Nonetheless, the Anaconda Plan laid the foundation for the Union's efforts to win the war and ultimately preserve the Union. Chapter 4: The War's Early Years. The early years of the Civil War, from 1861 to 1863, were marked by a series of battles, setbacks, and shifting strategies as both the Union and the Confederacy sought to gain the upper hand. While the Union's initial strategy, the Anaconda Plan, aimed to weaken the Confederacy over time, the Confederacy sought to defend its territory and achieve foreign recognition. Both sides were unprepared for the scale of the war, and early battles demonstrated the limitations of the military strategies of both sides. In the summer of 1861, the Union faced its first major test at the First Battle of Bull Run. Union forces under General Irvin McDowell were sent to engage the Confederate Army near Manassas, Virginia, with the goal of capturing the Confederate capital, Richmond. However, the battle quickly turned into a rout for the Union, as Confederate reinforcements arrived, and the Union Army was forced to retreat in disarray. This early defeat shocked the North and forced a reevaluation of its strategy. It became clear that the war would not be won with a single decisive battle, and that a long, drawn-out conflict was likely. Meanwhile, in the Western Theater, Union forces focused on gaining control of key Confederate strongholds, including those along the Mississippi River. The Union Army, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, made significant gains in 1862. Grant's victory at the Battle of Fort Donelson in February 1862 gave the Union control of vital river routes, and his subsequent victories at Shiloh in April demonstrated his aggressive and relentless style of warfare. Although the Battle of Shiloh was a bloody encounter with over 23,000 casualties combined, it showed the Union's growing ability to wage war on Southern soil. In the Eastern Theater, Union forces struggled to gain a decisive victory. The Union's efforts to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond were stymied by the Confederate Army, led by General Robert E. Lee. Lee's tactical brilliance and the Confederacy's defensive strategy made it difficult for Union forces to make progress. In 1862, Union General George B. McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, an ambitious attempt to capture Richmond, but his cautious approach and logistical issues allowed Lee's forces to hold the city and force McClellan into retreat. The war's early years also saw a growing recognition of the importance of securing foreign support. The Confederacy hoped that its cotton exports would prompt European nations, particularly Britain and France, to intervene on its behalf. However, despite the South's hopes, European powers remained neutral throughout the war, due to their dependence on alternative sources of cotton and a growing aversion to slavery. The Union also made moves to prevent the Confederacy from gaining foreign recognition, most notably through the blockade of Southern ports. In 1862, President Lincoln took a significant step by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it shifted the focus of the war toward abolition and weakened the Confederacy's war effort by undermining its labor force. By the end of 1862, both sides had suffered heavy casualties, and the war had become a protracted and brutal conflict. The Union was struggling to find a commander who could successfully lead its army, while the Confederacy was determined to defend its territory at all costs. The early years of the war had made it clear that victory would not come easily, and the war would continue to test the resolve and resources of both the Union and the Confederacy. The Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, in Sharpsburg, Maryland, was one of the most significant and bloodiest battles of the Civil War. It marked a turning point in the conflict, as it was the first major battle to take place on Northern soil, and was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. With over 22,000 casualties, the battle demonstrated the brutal reality of the war and highlighted the immense cost of the conflict for both the Union and the Confederacy. The battle began when General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, launched an invasion of the North in hopes of relieving pressure on Southern soil and possibly gaining foreign recognition for the Confederacy. Lee's army had enjoyed a series of successes in the Eastern Theater, and after victories in battles like the Second Battle of Bull Run and the Battle of Cedar Mountain, he felt confident in his ability to push further into Union territory. His goal at Antietam was to deliver a decisive blow to the Union forces, further demoralizing the North and potentially encouraging Europe to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. The Union Army of the Potomac, led by General George B. McClellan, was tasked with stopping Lee's advance. McClellan, known for his cautious nature, had previously failed to pursue Lee aggressively after the Battle of the 7 Days, but at Antietam he finally took a more proactive approach. The two armies met near Antietam Creek, and intense fighting erupted early in the morning. The battle unfolded in 3 distinct phases, with Union forces attacking on the left, center, and right of the Confederate line. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in the chaotic combat. Despite being outnumbered, Lee's forces initially held their ground, forcing the Union troops to fight for every inch of territory. However, McClellan's hesitancy and failure to exploit early advantages allowed Lee's forces to regroup and resist the Union onslaught. Throughout the day, both sides launched desperate attacks, and by the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with the dead and wounded. The Union forces made some gains, but Lee's army was still largely intact and had not been decisively defeated. The Battle of Antietam ended in a tactical stalemate, with neither side achieving a clear victory. However, the Union's ability to prevent Lee from advancing further into the North was seen as a strategic success. More importantly, the battle provided President Abraham Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which he had been planning for some time. The proclamation, which declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be freed, shifted the war's focus to the abolition of slavery and gave the Union a moral cause for its fight. Although Antietam did not deliver a decisive military victory for the Union, it marked a pivotal moment in the war. The battle showcased the enormous scale of the conflict and the sacrifices both sides were making. It also forced the Confederacy to reconsider its hopes for foreign intervention, as the failure to achieve a victory on Northern soil weakened their position internationally. The Battle of Antietam demonstrated that the war would continue to be long, grueling, and costly, with no easy path to victory for either side. The Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, was a landmark moment in the Civil War and in American history. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. While the proclamation did not immediately end slavery, it fundamentally shifted the war's purpose and set the nation on a course toward abolishing the institution of slavery altogether. The decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation came after months of consideration and political calculation. By 1862, it had become clear that the war was not just a conflict to preserve the Union, but also a battle over the future of slavery. The Confederacy, which had seceded from the Union, was founded on the preservation of slavery as a key part of its social and economic system. The Union's military efforts were beginning to focus more on weakening the South's economy and military strength, and it was evident that slavery played a central role in the Confederacy's ability to sustain itself. Lincoln had long been personally opposed to slavery, but his initial focus was on preserving the Union rather than immediately pushing for emancipation. He recognized that taking action on slavery would have significant consequences, both for the war and for the Union's political unity. As the war dragged on, however, Lincoln came to see that ending slavery was both a moral necessity and a strategic military advantage. The Confederacy relied on enslaved labor to support its economy, and freeing the slaves would undermine the South's war effort. The Emancipation Proclamation was also a response to the changing dynamics of the war. Union victories, such as the Battle of Antietam in 1862, gave Lincoln the political leverage to act decisively on the issue of slavery. After Antietam, Lincoln felt that the Union had secured a military position that allowed him to issue the proclamation without risking the Union's stability. He also knew that the proclamation would have the dual effect of strengthening the Union's moral cause while weakening the Confederacy's economic foundation. The proclamation declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states shall be thenceforward and forever free. However, it applied only to areas under Confederate control and did not affect slaveholding border states like Kentucky and Missouri, which remained loyal to the Union. In this sense, the Emancipation Proclamation was a strategic war measure designed to weaken the Confederacy rather than a blanket abolition of slavery across the nation. While the Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it marked a significant turning point in the war. It gave the Union a moral cause and changed the character of the conflict. The war was now not only about preserving the Union, but also about ending slavery. The proclamation also allowed for the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army, further strengthening its forces. The Emancipation Proclamation ultimately laid the groundwork for the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which would formally abolish slavery in the United States. The turning tide. By 1863, the Civil War had shifted dramatically, with key Union victories starting to change the course of the conflict. The turning tide of the war came from a combination of military victories, strategic changes, and the shifting morale of both the Union and the Confederacy. While the Confederacy had enjoyed early successes and had been able to maintain a defensive posture, the Union began to gain the upper hand as new leadership, resources, and battlefield strategies took effect. One of the most important turning points came in the Western theater, particularly with the Union's victory at the Battle of Vicksburg in July 1863. Vicksburg was one of the last Confederate strongholds along the Mississippi River, and its capture by Union General Ulysses S. Grant split the Confederacy in two. The Union now controlled the entire length of the Mississippi River, severing the Confederate supply lines and making it more difficult for the South to move troops and supplies. This victory was crucial in weakening the Confederacy's war effort, as it deprived them of vital strategic territory. At the same time, in the Eastern Theater, the Union Army under General George G. Meade achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863. This battle was the largest and one of the most decisive of the war. It marked the first major defeat of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lee had hoped that a victory on Union soil would strengthen the South's position, possibly lead to foreign recognition, and disrupt Northern morale. However, the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg dashed these hopes. Lee's army was forced to retreat back into the South, and the Confederacy never again regained the initiative in the war. These two key victories, at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, marked a critical shift in the balance of power. The Confederacy, once full of hope and momentum, now found itself facing increasing difficulty in holding its ground against the Union's growing forces. At the same time, the Union gained confidence, especially with Grant's continued successes in the West. Grant's ability to keep fighting and his strategy of relentless pursuit made him a central figure in the Union's eventual victory. Furthermore, the war's focus shifted as President Lincoln continued to push for the abolition of slavery, strengthening the moral cause of the Union and providing it with new political leverage. The Emancipation Proclamation had already weakened the Confederacy by depriving it of enslaved labor, and the increasing recruitment of African American soldiers bolstered the Union Army. By 1863, it became evident that the war was moving toward a conclusion, with the Union beginning to overwhelm the Confederacy militarily, economically, and politically. The turning tide of the war, characterized by these significant military victories and strategic shifts, set the stage for the Union's eventual triumph. The Confederacy was no longer able to sustain its initial successes, and it became increasingly clear that the war would ultimately end in defeat for the South. Chapter 5: The conflict intensifies. As the Civil War progressed into 1863, the conflict intensified on both the battlefield and the home front. The Union and the Confederacy, each facing mounting pressures, engaged in some of the most brutal and decisive battles of the war. The stakes of the war were now clear. The Union was committed to preserving itself, and the Confederacy was determined to secure its independence. This period of the war saw a series of fierce confrontations, leadership changes, and strategic decisions that shaped the course of the conflict. One of the most significant developments in 1863 was the appointment of General Ulysses S. Grant as the commander of all Union armies. Grant, who had proven his abilities in the Western theater, brought a new approach to the war. His strategy emphasized relentless pressure on the Confederacy, using the Union's numerical and resource advantages to wear down Southern forces. Grant's leadership marked a turning point in the war, as he pursued a war of attrition that sought to exhaust the Confederacy rather than relying on occasional decisive battles. In the Eastern Theater, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia continued to perform well, despite the increasing strain of prolonged conflict. However, Lee's forces began to face greater challenges in 1863. After the defeat at Gettysburg, Lee's army was forced into retreat, and it struggled to maintain its momentum. The battle had been a major blow to the Confederacy, and Lee's inability to secure a victory on Northern soil marked a turning point in the war. While Lee's tactical brilliance was undeniable, the Confederacy's limited resources made it difficult for him to sustain offensive operations. At the same time, Union forces were gaining ground in the Western theater. The Union's victory at the Battle of Vicksburg, combined with Grant's subsequent efforts, effectively split the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi River. This victory was a crucial part of the Union's strategy, as it severed the South's vital supply lines and divided its territory. With control of the river, the Union could now focus on the remaining Confederate strongholds, making it increasingly difficult for the South to sustain its war effort. On the home front, both sides were dealing with growing unrest and shortages. The Confederacy's economy, which had been heavily reliant on agriculture and enslaved labor, began to crumble as Union blockades cut off vital supplies. In the North, while the war effort was better funded, dissent was growing, and there was increasing dissatisfaction with the high number of casualties and the prolonged nature of the conflict. As 1863 came to a close, the intensity of the war continued to escalate. Both the Union and the Confederacy were becoming more entrenched in their positions, with neither side willing to yield. The war had entered a new phase, one marked by the unrelenting pressure of total war, and it was clear that the outcome would depend on who could endure the longest. The conflict, now more brutal and widespread than ever, would soon reach its breaking point. The Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863, was one of the most significant battles of the American Civil War and marked a major turning point in the conflict. It was the largest battle ever fought in North America, involving over 160,000 soldiers, and resulted in more than 50,000 casualties. The Union's victory at Gettysburg halted General Robert E. Lee's second invasion of the North and was a decisive blow to the Confederacy's hopes of securing foreign recognition and independence. The battle began when Confederate forces, under General Lee, advanced into Pennsylvania with the goal of threatening northern cities and possibly influencing the political situation in the Union. Lee hoped that a victory on northern soil would force the Union to negotiate for peace, and potentially encourage European powers like Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy. The Union Army, led by General George G. Meade, moved to block Lee's advance and defend key positions. On the first day of battle, Confederate forces initially gained ground, pushing the Union Army through the town of Gettysburg. However, the Union forces managed to establish defensive positions on high ground to the south of the town, including Cemetery Hill, Little Round Top, and Cemetery Ridge. These positions proved to be critical in the battle's outcome, as they gave the Union Army a strong defensive advantage. On the second day, Lee attempted to break the Union line by attacking both the Union left and right flanks. The battle became intensely fierce, as Confederate forces launched assaults on positions like Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den. Despite initial successes in some areas, the Confederates were unable to break through the Union lines. The Union defenders, aided by reinforcements, held their positions and repelled the Confederate attacks. The third day of the battle saw Lee make a desperate attempt to break the center of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge. This final offensive, known as Pickett's Charge, involved approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers charging across open fields under heavy artillery and rifle fire. The charge ended in disaster for the Confederacy, with more than half of the attacking force either killed, wounded, or captured. The failure of Pickett's charge marked the end of Lee's offensive, and his army was forced to retreat back to the south. The Union's victory at Gettysburg was a significant turning point in the Civil War. It marked the first major defeat for General Lee and the Confederate Army, which had been on the offensive for much of the war. The Confederate Army's inability to gain a victory on Northern soil shattered hopes of diplomatic recognition and weakened morale in the South. For the Union, the victory bolstered morale and solidified the leadership of General Meade, although his performance in the battle was later scrutinized. Gettysburg, combined with the Union victory at Vicksburg, which occurred around the same time, turned the tide of the war in favor of the North. The Confederacy, now on the defensive, faced an uphill struggle to maintain its war effort. The Battle of Gettysburg proved that the war would not be won easily for either side, but it marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy's aspirations of independence. The Siege of Vicksburg. The Siege of Vicksburg, which lasted from May 18 to July 4, 1863, was a pivotal military campaign in the American Civil War, marking the Union's successful attempt to gain control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two. The Union victory at Vicksburg, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, was a significant turning point in the war, severely weakening the Confederate military position and altering the course of the conflict. Vicksburg was strategically important due to its location on a high bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. The city was one of the last Confederate strongholds along the river, and its capture would grant the Union control over the entire Mississippi, cutting off vital supply lines to the Western Confederacy. For this reason, General Grant made capturing Vicksburg a top priority in his campaign to divide the Confederacy and isolate the South's western territories. The campaign began with a series of failed attempts to take the city by direct assault. Grant's forces initially tried to move in from the north, but the Confederate defenses, commanded by General John C. Pemberton, proved formidable. The terrain around Vicksburg, with its steep bluffs and heavily fortified positions, made direct attacks difficult. Realizing that a quick victory was unlikely, Grant decided to change tactics and lay siege to the city, cutting off supplies and reinforcements in an attempt to force a Confederate surrender. Grant's siege strategy involved surrounding the city and cutting off all supply lines to the Confederate forces inside. He established a series of trenches and forts around Vicksburg, effectively trapping the Confederate defenders. Over the following weeks, the Union forces relentlessly bombarded the city with artillery, while Pemberton's forces, already suffering from a lack of food and supplies, were forced to endure the hardships of the siege. The civilians of Vicksburg also suffered during the siege, as they took refuge in caves and bomb-proof shelters to escape the constant shelling. The combination of deprivation, starvation, and constant bombardment led to a breakdown in morale among the Confederate defenders and the civilian population. By July 4, after weeks of fighting, Pemberton, realizing that further resistance was futile and with his forces on the brink of collapse, surrendered Vicksburg to Grant. The surrender was a major blow to the Confederacy, as it not only gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, but also effectively split the Confederacy in two, severing communication and supply lines between the eastern and western Confederate states. The Union victory at Vicksburg, combined with the win at Gettysburg just days earlier, marked a turning point in the Civil War. It gave the Union significant control over the South and deprived the Confederacy of critical resources. The success of the siege also solidified Grant's reputation as a determined and capable military leader, and he would go on to become the general who ultimately led the Union to victory. For the Confederacy, the loss of Vicksburg was a devastating blow that further weakened its ability to sustain the war effort. The rise of Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant's rise to prominence during the American Civil War was marked by a combination of military skill, perseverance, and a determination to bring the Union victory. Initially viewed as a relatively unknown and unremarkable officer, Grant's successes on the battlefield would eventually lead him to become the commanding general of all Union forces and play a central role in the defeat of the Confederacy. Grant's early career was not characterized by immediate success. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1843, and after serving in the Mexican-American War, he struggled with a lack of direction in his civilian life. Grant resigned from the Army in 1854 due to personal and professional issues and faced a series of failed business ventures. However, the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 marked a dramatic shift in his life, and it would be in the Union Army that Grant would find his calling. Grant's initial military experience in the Civil War came as a colonel in Illinois' volunteer forces. His ability to organize and lead troops quickly became apparent. His early success came at the Battle of Fort Donelson in February 1862, where he captured a significant Confederate fort, earning him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. This victory was crucial as it opened up the Tennessee River and allowed Union forces to advance deeper into the South. Grant's willingness to accept no terms but unconditional surrender from the Confederates earned him both admiration and criticism, but it also marked him as a determined and unyielding commander. Following his victory at Fort Donelson, Grant continued to rise through the ranks. His success at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, despite the high casualties on both sides, further solidified his reputation. Although the battle was costly, it was a Union victory, and it showed Grant's ability to recover and keep his forces intact under pressure. His resolve and his refusal to abandon his position, despite early setbacks, demonstrated a level of resilience that would become a hallmark of his leadership style. Grant's leadership and successes did not come without controversy, as his willingness to sacrifice large numbers of troops was criticized by some, including political figures and military leaders. However, his strategy of constant pressure and relentless pursuit of the enemy began to pay off. By 1863, after his victory at Vicksburg, Grant had become a central figure in the Union war effort. His ability to win critical battles in the Western theater earned him the command of all Union armies in 1864, where he would bring a coordinated strategy of attrition to the Eastern theater. Grant's rise to prominence was not just about individual victories, but about his broader understanding of total war. His ability to manage the Union's military resources and keep up the pressure on the Confederacy ultimately led to the defeat of Robert E. Lee's forces and the end of the war. Grant's rise from a failed civilian to the Union's most successful general proved that his initial setbacks in life were merely a prelude to his ultimate success. His leadership would leave a lasting legacy, both as a military leader and later as the 18th President of the United States. Chapter 6: The End of the Confederacy. By 1864, the Confederacy was on the brink of collapse. Despite early successes and resilience, the Southern states found themselves overwhelmed by the Union's superior resources, manpower, and industrial capacity. The leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant, now in command of all Union forces, and the continued pressure from Union armies in both the East and West led to the inevitable downfall of the Confederacy. The final years of the war were marked by intense battles, significant losses, and strategic decisions that ultimately sealed the South's fate. The turning point came in 1864, when General Grant began his campaign of attrition against the Confederate Army, particularly in the Eastern Theater. Grant's strategy was simple yet relentless. He would engage General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in constant bloody battles, never allowing Lee a chance to regroup or recover. The result was a series of engagements that exhausted Confederate forces, both in terms of manpower and morale. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor saw high casualties, and while the Union did not always achieve decisive victories, Grant's forces kept advancing, slowly wearing down Lee's army. Simultaneously, in the Western Theater, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman waged a devastating campaign through Georgia. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864 was a major blow to the Confederacy, both strategically and psychologically. Atlanta was a key railroad hub and industrial center for the South, and its loss further crippled the Confederate war effort. Sherman's subsequent march to the sea, in which he led his army from Atlanta to Savannah, caused widespread destruction across Georgia, breaking the Confederates' ability to wage war by cutting off vital supplies and infrastructure. The Union's victories in 1864 paved the way for the final push in 1865. By early 1865, the Confederacy was in disarray. The South's economy was collapsing due to the Union blockade, and the Confederate government, already weak and divided, could no longer sustain the war effort. Lee's army was steadily retreating, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis found it increasingly difficult to rally support. The end came on April 9, 1865, when General Lee, faced with no viable escape route, and after months of constant pressure, surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The surrender at Appomattox marked the symbolic end of the Confederacy, though smaller Confederate forces continued to surrender in the following weeks. The collapse of the South was not just a military defeat, but the loss of an entire way of life centered around slavery and states' rights. The Confederacy's inability to withstand the Union's resources, and the determined leadership of Grant and Sherman, ultimately sealed its fate. The end of the Confederacy also marked the beginning of the process of Reconstruction, as the United States faced the challenge of reintegrating the Southern states and addressing the aftermath of slavery. The Union's victory in the Civil War, while preserving the nation, came at an enormous cost in terms of lives and resources. The Confederacy's fall not only ended the secession movement, but also set the stage for the long and difficult journey toward rebuilding the nation and healing its divisions. General Sherman's March to the Sea. General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, which took place from November 15 to December 21, 1864, was one of the most daring and controversial military campaigns of the Civil War. After capturing Atlanta in September 1864, Sherman set out to march across Georgia, from the city of Atlanta to the port of Savannah, leaving behind a path of destruction in an effort to break the Confederate war effort. The march was a key part of the Union's strategy of total war, which aimed not only to defeat Confederate armies, but to destroy the resources and infrastructure that supported them. Sherman's strategy was based on the idea of crippling the South's ability to wage war by targeting not just military forces, but also the civilian infrastructure that sustained them. Sherman's army, consisting of around 60,000 men, traveled through Georgia with the objective of disrupting the South's economy, destroying railroad lines, crops, livestock, and factories, and demoralizing the Confederate population. The march was designed to show the Confederacy that the Union could strike at the heart of its territory, causing psychological and material damage that would help hasten the end of the war. Sherman's forces encountered little organized resistance as they moved through Georgia, as most of the Confederate army had been withdrawn to defend other parts of the South. However, the destruction left in the wake of the march was devastating. Sherman's troops systematically tore up railroad tracks, burned buildings, and looted towns. The destruction of farmland and the theft of livestock left many Southern civilians without food and resources, deepening the hardships of the war for the South. Sherman's forces also captured valuable supplies and destroyed weapons factories, which deprived the Confederacy of important war materials. While Sherman's tactics were effective in weakening the Confederacy, they also sparked considerable controversy. Many in the North, particularly civilians and politicians, were troubled by the scale of destruction and the targeting of civilian property. Sherman, however, defended his actions, arguing that the destruction of the South's infrastructure would hasten the end of the war and ultimately save lives by reducing the need for further fighting. He believed that by breaking the South's will to fight, the Union would be able to bring a quicker end to the war. Sherman's march reached its culmination when he captured the port city of Savannah on December 21, 1864. His army had covered around 300 miles in just over a month, inflicting significant damage to the South's resources and morale. The capture of Savannah was a crucial victory, as it provided the Union with a valuable supply port and dealt a further blow to Confederate hopes of winning the war. Sherman's success in Georgia helped solidify his reputation as one of the Union's most aggressive and innovative commanders. The march was one of the final blows to the Confederacy's ability to continue the war. While it was not without its critics, Sherman's march to the sea proved to be an essential part of the Union's overall strategy, helping to pave the way for the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. The campaign embodied the harshness of total war, but it also demonstrated the Union's determination to end the conflict as quickly and decisively as possible. The surrender at Appomattox. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, marked the official end of the Civil War and the beginning of the process of national reunification. After nearly 4 years of brutal conflict, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, faced the inevitable collapse of his forces. Union General Ulysses S. Grant, whose relentless strategy of attrition had worn down the Confederate Army, was finally positioned to accept Lee's surrender. The event took place in the small Virginia village of Appomattox Courthouse, where the two generals met to negotiate the terms of surrender, effectively sealing the fate of the Confederacy. By the time of the surrender, Lee's army was exhausted, having been pursued and pressured by Grant's forces for months. The Confederacy was in disarray, with its infrastructure destroyed, its economy in shambles, and its soldiers demoralized. Lee had attempted to retreat and join forces with other Confederate troops in the South, but he was blocked by Union forces. With his army surrounded and no hope of victory, Lee realized that further resistance would only lead to more unnecessary bloodshed. He sent a message to Grant, requesting a meeting to discuss terms of surrender. Grant, understanding the gravity of the moment, was determined to offer generous terms that would facilitate the smooth reintegration of the South into the Union. His goal was to avoid unnecessary humiliation for Lee and his men, recognizing that the country needed to heal from the divisions of the war. Grant agreed to meet Lee at the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, where the two generals met on the afternoon of April 9. Lee arrived with a small group of officers, while Grant appeared with his staff, including several prominent Union generals. The terms of surrender were straightforward and generous. Lee's troops would be allowed to keep their horses and return home, and they would not be prosecuted for treason. They were also given provisions to help them on their way. Grant's terms were designed to avoid further bitterness and to help the Southern soldiers return to civilian life as quickly as possible, signaling that the Union was interested in reconciliation rather than punishment. Lee accepted the terms without hesitation, and the surrender was formalized. The terms were sent out to other Confederate commanders, signaling the end of major military resistance. Although the war did not officially end immediately, as other Confederate forces remained in the field, Lee's surrender effectively marked the collapse of the Confederacy. The Union had won, and the Confederacy's attempt to break away from the Union had failed. The surrender at Appomattox was a moment of reflection and reconciliation, with both Lee and Grant recognizing the enormous sacrifices made by both sides. For the Union, it was the culmination of years of struggle and loss, but it also marked the beginning of the difficult process of rebuilding a fractured nation. The Civil War was over, but the challenges of reintegration and healing the deep divisions between the North and South were just beginning. The terms of surrender, with their emphasis on leniency and unity, set the tone for the subsequent Reconstruction era, though much work remained to truly reunite the country. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, was a tragic and shocking event that occurred just days after the end of the Civil War. Lincoln had led the nation through its darkest period, guiding the Union to victory and helping to end the institution of slavery. His assassination, carried out by John Wilkes Booth, not only deprived the country of its leader but also plunged the nation into a new crisis, at a time when it was already deeply divided and facing the difficult task of reconstruction. Booth, a well-known actor and a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, was angered by the Union's victory in the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. He had initially planned to kidnap Lincoln and hold him for ransom in exchange for the release of Confederate prisoners of war, but as the war came to a close, Booth's plans shifted. With the Confederacy's defeat imminent, Booth resolved to take more drastic action. On the night of April 14th, he entered Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., where Lincoln was attending a performance of the play Our American Cousin. Booth, carrying a small pistol, sneaked up behind the president during a moment of laughter and shot him in the back of the head. Booth then leapt onto the stage shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, before fleeing the scene. Lincoln, gravely wounded, was carried across the street to the Peterson House, where doctors attempted to save him. However, despite their efforts, Lincoln died early the following morning on April 15, 1865. His death was met with shock and sorrow across the nation. For the North, it was a devastating blow after the long years of war, and for the South, it marked the loss of the man they had come to see as a symbol of union and freedom. Booth's assassination of Lincoln was part of a larger conspiracy to destabilize the Union government. Booth had also planned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward, though these attempts were unsuccessful. Seward survived a stabbing, and Johnson was not harmed. After the assassination, Booth fled to southern Maryland, where he was eventually tracked down and killed by Union soldiers. Lincoln's assassination came at a time when the nation was struggling to rebuild itself after the war. His death left a leadership vacuum, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, faced enormous challenges in navigating the delicate process of Reconstruction. Lincoln had been seen as a unifying figure, and his assassination deepened the divisions between the North and South. In the years that followed, the loss of Lincoln would be felt deeply, as the nation tried to move forward without the guidance of the leader who had seen it through its most difficult period.
The Big Burn. Teddy Roosevelt and the Fire That Saved the United States of America. Chapter 1. The Roots of Conservation. In the late 19th century, America's wilderness was rapidly shrinking under the weight of industrial expansion. Vast forests, once untouched, were being stripped bare by powerful timber companies seeking profit from a seemingly endless supply of trees. Railroads extended deeper into the frontier, bringing with them settlers, machinery, and a hunger for resources. The logging industry was booming, and the land suffered under this momentum. Streams clogged with debris, mountainsides were stripped of their trees, and the land that had once seemed eternal began to vanish. Yet amid this progress, a growing awareness began to stir among a few voices warning that this reckless consumption could have dire consequences. The early environmental movement took root in this context. Philosophers and naturalists, such as John Muir, began to advocate for the protection of America's natural wonders. They believed in nature not just as a resource, but as something sacred and necessary for the soul of the nation. Meanwhile, others, like Gifford Pinchot, began to promote a more pragmatic approach, conservation rather than preservation. This idea focused on the responsible use of natural resources, ensuring they could support both present needs and future generations. As the forests fell and rivers ran dark with silt, these differing but passionate calls began to gain traction in public discourse. Among the most powerful champions of this growing conservation ethic was Theodore Roosevelt. Having spent his youth in the wilds of the American West, Roosevelt had a personal and political appreciation for the natural world. His presidency would become a turning point for the conservation movement. With a deep sense of urgency and a fierce independence, Roosevelt used his executive power to set aside millions of acres of forest land, establish national parks, and support the formation of institutions that would protect the environment. He believed that the government had a moral responsibility to act as a steward of the land, and he had little patience for those who exploited it for short-term gain. Roosevelt's administration marked the beginning of an era in which conservation became national policy rather than an obscure ideal. By the turn of the century, America was at a crossroads. Would it continue to allow private industries to dictate the fate of its natural resources, or would it adopt a long-term strategy to protect its land and people? The answer would come in the form of sweeping legislation, fiery debates, and ultimately, a massive fire that would test everything the conservation movement had built. But before the flames came, before the smoke filled the skies, there was a vision of balance, protection, and responsibility that set the foundation for everything that followed. The roots of conservation had taken hold, but whether they would endure would depend on what came next. The rise of industrial logging. The late 19th century saw the United States undergoing a radical transformation. As the nation expanded westward, the Industrial Revolution reshaped the landscape. With new technologies, transportation systems, and growing demand for resources, industries began to exploit the vast forests that covered much of the country. Timber, once a modest industry, grew into a massive enterprise, changing not only the physical environment, but the way people viewed the land. The rise of industrial logging was driven by the demands of an ever-growing economy, with lumber becoming a vital resource for building homes, railroads, factories, and other structures critical to the nation's development. In the early days, logging was a more localized, small-scale operation. Men would cut down trees in the woods, saw them into lumber, and transport them to nearby towns. But as the population grew, so did the demand for timber. The introduction of steam-powered sawmills allowed companies to process wood faster and more efficiently. The advent of railroads also made it possible to transport lumber over much longer distances. Timber companies began pushing deeper into previously untapped forests, clear-cutting massive sections of land, in a race to meet the increasing demand for wood products. This rapid expansion and mechanization were crucial in the development of major cities, but the consequences for the environment were significant. The techniques used by industrial loggers were often wasteful. Trees were felled with little regard for the long-term health of the forest. In many cases, entire forests were leveled, leaving barren landscapes in their wake. The clear-cutting method, where every tree in an area was taken, became widespread. This left behind no buffer of trees to protect the land from erosion, leading to damaged ecosystems and disrupted water cycles. Rivers clogged with logs, which would be left to rot in the sun, added to the growing environmental damage. Additionally, once the timber companies had stripped an area of its trees, they would move on, leaving behind only desolation. The unchecked growth of the logging industry alarmed some observers. Early environmentalists, including figures like John Muir, began to raise awareness about the dangers of this unsustainable practice. Yet despite their warnings, the pressure to extract more timber was unrelenting. The economic benefits of industrial logging were clear to many. Lumber was an essential material for building the rapidly expanding nation, and it created thousands of jobs. Timber companies, backed by powerful political interests, had little incentive to slow down their operations. In response to these mounting concerns, some leaders began to call for the preservation of certain parts of the country's wilderness. They argued that the natural beauty of forests, mountains, and rivers was a priceless asset that could not be measured solely in economic terms. But these early conservation efforts faced significant opposition from those who saw nature as a resource to be exploited for progress. It was in this climate of industrial growth and environmental destruction that the rise of the conservation movement gained momentum, spearheaded by figures like Theodore Roosevelt. His presidency would mark the beginning of a new approach to managing the nation's natural resources, one that sought to balance industrial progress with responsible stewardship. The struggle to reconcile development with conservation was just beginning, and the battle would play out in the coming decades with an intensity that few could have predicted. Early environmental movements. The Industrial Revolution had a profound impact on the landscape of the United States. While it spurred economic growth, it also led to widespread environmental degradation. As factories, railroads, and cities expanded across the nation, the destruction of natural habitats became more prevalent. Amid this rapid development, a handful of forward-thinking individuals began to raise their voices in opposition to the unchecked exploitation of the land. These early environmental movements were born out of a growing awareness of the need to protect America's natural resources from the relentless forces of industrialization. The first stirrings of the environmental movement in the U.S. can be traced back to the mid-19th century, when figures like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson began to challenge the prevailing attitudes toward nature. Thoreau's seminal work, Walden, which chronicled his experiment of living simply and in close connection with nature, helped to shift public perception about the importance of the wilderness. He argued that nature was not just a resource to be used, but a spiritual refuge that could teach people about life and the human soul. Similarly, Emerson emphasized the connection between the individual and the natural world, calling for a deeper appreciation of the wilderness. While these early works laid the philosophical groundwork for environmentalism, it was not until the late 19th century that organized efforts to protect the environment began to take shape. In 1864, George Perkins Marsh published Man and Nature, which highlighted the destructive impact humans were having on the land. Marsh's work called attention to the unsustainable practices of timber cutting, overgrazing, and agricultural expansion. He argued that the earth was a finite resource that could be depleted if not managed wisely. This was one of the first calls for conservation that resonated with a wider audience. At the same time, a growing number of conservation-minded individuals began to organize efforts to protect America's scenic wonders. John Muir, the Scottish-born naturalist, was one of the most prominent figures in this movement. Muir was deeply influenced by his experiences in the wilderness and became a passionate advocate for preserving the country's natural beauty. His efforts were instrumental in the creation of national parks, including Yosemite National Park, which was designated as a national park in 1890. Muir's writing and activism sparked the public's interest in preserving the wild places of the United States. He also founded the Sierra Club in 1892, which became one of the most important environmental organizations in the country. Another key figure in the early environmental movement was Gifford Pinchot, who approached conservation from a more pragmatic angle. Pinchot, trained as a forester, believed in the responsible management of natural resources. Unlike Muir, who advocated for the preservation of wilderness areas in their natural state, Pinchot promoted the idea of conservation, which focused on the sustainable use of resources for the benefit of future generations. He was appointed the first head of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 by Theodore Roosevelt, where he worked to balance the needs of industry with the protection of the nation's forests. These early environmental movements laid the foundation for what would become a broader national movement in the 20th century. They helped to shift public attitudes about the role of government and society in protecting the environment. As the industrial age continued to expand, the question of how to balance progress with preservation became increasingly urgent. The seeds of the modern environmental movement were planted in this period, setting the stage for the larger battles over conservation that would come in the years ahead. The efforts of these early environmentalists paved the way for the creation of national parks, forests, and the eventual establishment of policies to manage and protect America's natural resources. Roosevelt's vision for American forests. Theodore Roosevelt was not only a president who championed the expansion of American power and influence, but he also became a visionary for the preservation and management of the nation's natural resources. Growing up in New York, Roosevelt had a deep connection to nature. His experiences in the Adirondacks, where he spent his formative years exploring the wild landscapes, played a significant role in shaping his views on conservation. However, it was his presidency that saw the full realization of his environmental vision, particularly when it came to the protection and management of the nation's forests. Roosevelt recognized the immense value of America's forests, both for their ecological significance and for their potential to support industries like timber. But he also understood that left unchecked, these forests would be stripped away, leaving the land barren and unproductive. His vision for American forests was not one of complete preservation, but rather one of conservation, a sustainable use of the land that would allow for both growth and responsible management. Roosevelt believed that the government should step in to protect and manage these forests, ensuring they could be used wisely for future generations. One of Roosevelt's key contributions was the establishment of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905, under the leadership of Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot, who shared Roosevelt's belief in conservation, worked alongside the president to ensure that America's public forests were managed in a way that balanced the needs of industry with the long-term health of the land. Roosevelt's administration marked the beginning of a new approach to the management of federal lands, as he began to set aside millions of acres for national forests. By the time he left office in 1909, Roosevelt had signed into law the creation of 150 national forests, encompassing approximately 150 million acres of land. Roosevelt's efforts to create national forests were groundbreaking. Prior to his presidency, the federal government had done little to regulate the use of public lands. Timber companies were allowed to extract resources without regard for the environmental consequences, and vast areas of forest were destroyed in the name of economic progress. Roosevelt believed that this unregulated exploitation of public lands was not only irresponsible, but also short-sighted. He saw that if left unprotected, these forests could be irreparably damaged, leading to soil erosion, water contamination, and the loss of wildlife habitats. For Roosevelt, the preservation of forests was not just about saving trees, but about safeguarding the broader ecological health of the nation. Roosevelt also believed that the conservation of forests was intimately tied to the future of the American economy. He saw forests as critical to the country's economic well-being, not just for the timber industry, but for agriculture, water supply, and recreation. By establishing national forests, Roosevelt hoped to create a long-term system of land management that would benefit future generations of Americans. In his view, the government had a responsibility to ensure that these resources were not squandered but used wisely and efficiently. Roosevelt's vision for American forests laid the groundwork for the modern conservation movement. His commitment to the protection and sustainable management of natural resources set a precedent for future presidents and lawmakers. The establishment of the U.S. Forest Service and the creation of national forests ensured that the government would play an active role in protecting America's natural landscapes, and his actions demonstrated that it was possible to balance the needs of industry with the preservation of the environment. Roosevelt's legacy as a conservationist remains one of the most enduring aspects of his presidency, and his vision for America's forests continues to shape environmental policy to this day. Chapter 2: A President with Purpose. When Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency in 1901, he brought with him a sense of vigor and determination that would define his time in office. A man of deep convictions and boundless energy, Roosevelt quickly became a leader who was unafraid to tackle the most pressing issues facing the nation. Among his most profound legacies was his commitment to conservation and the protection of America's natural resources, which he believed were not only critical for the environment, but for the future of the nation itself. His approach to conservation was rooted in his belief that the government had an active role to play in managing the country's resources and ensuring their sustainability for generations to come. One of Roosevelt's most significant contributions to conservation was his relationship with Gifford Pinchot, a trained forester who shared Roosevelt's vision for the responsible use of the nation's forests. Pinchot, who would later become the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, believed in what he called conservation, the wise use of natural resources to meet the needs of society without depleting them. Roosevelt and Pinchot shared a common belief that natural resources should be managed in a way that benefited both the economy and the environment. Under Roosevelt's leadership, this philosophy became the foundation of national conservation efforts, with the president himself acting as a steward of the land. Roosevelt's commitment to conservation was not just ideological, it was practical. He understood that the rapid expansion of industry, especially the timber industry, posed a direct threat to the environment. As the nation's forests were being cleared at an alarming rate, Roosevelt recognized that immediate action was needed. He used the power of the presidency to act decisively, setting the stage for the creation of the U.S. Forest Service and the establishment of national forests across the country. His efforts were not merely symbolic, they led to tangible changes that reshaped how the United States approached land management. Roosevelt's vision extended beyond the protection of forests. He was deeply concerned about the degradation of the nation's rivers, lands, and wildlife. He believed that these resources were essential to the nation's prosperity and well-being, both for economic reasons and for the cultural and recreational value they provided. The development of infrastructure, the growth of cities, and the expansion of agriculture all came at a cost to the environment. Roosevelt understood that unchecked development would not only lead to the loss of natural beauty, but also to economic instability, as the land could no longer sustain the needs of an ever-growing population. Under Roosevelt, the federal government took a more active role in managing the country's natural resources. He expanded the national park system, set aside millions of acres of land as national monuments, and increased the number of national forests under federal protection. By the end of his presidency, Roosevelt had created 150 national forests, added 18 national monuments, and established 5 national parks. His actions were a direct challenge to the prevailing notion that the land was an unlimited resource, available for exploitation without consideration for the future. Roosevelt's purpose was clear: to ensure that the land was protected for future generations. His leadership in conservation laid the groundwork for future environmental policies and set a precedent for government intervention in natural resource management. His vision of conservation was not about preservation in the traditional sense, but about the sustainable use of resources, ensuring that America's natural beauty and resources could be enjoyed by future generations, just as they had been by those before them. Roosevelt's presidency marked a turning point in American environmental policy, and his legacy continues to resonate in the conservation efforts of today. Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot. The partnership between Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot became one of the most influential collaborations in American conservation history. Pinchot, a trained forester, shared Roosevelt's belief in the responsible management of natural resources, and their combined efforts would lay the groundwork for the future of conservation in the United States. Roosevelt, with his boundless energy and forward-thinking vision, and Pinchot, with his technical expertise and passion for resource management, complemented each other perfectly. Together, they transformed the way the nation viewed its natural resources and established a new paradigm for the government's role in preserving and managing public lands. Pinchot's influence on Roosevelt's thinking about conservation was significant. As a young man, Pinchot had been educated in Europe, where he had studied forestry and learned about the European model of sustainable forest management. He believed in the idea of conservation, using natural resources wisely and efficiently while ensuring their availability for future generations. He did not see conservation as a call for total preservation, like some environmentalists of the time, but rather as a practical approach to managing resources in a way that balanced economic needs with environmental sustainability. This was a philosophy that resonated deeply with Roosevelt, who was not an advocate for preserving land from use, but for managing it in a responsible and balanced way. The relationship between Roosevelt and Pinchot began in the early 1900s, and it quickly blossomed into a powerful partnership. Pinchot's technical expertise in forestry and his ability to articulate the practical benefits of conservation made him a key advisor to Roosevelt. In 1905, Roosevelt appointed Pinchot as the first chief of the newly established U.S. Forest Service. This was a significant moment in American history, as it marked the beginning of a federal effort to regulate and protect the nation's forests. Pinchot's leadership in the Forest Service was instrumental in shaping its policies, and his ideas about conservation were put into practice under Roosevelt's direction. Roosevelt's belief in conservation went hand in hand with his commitment to using the government to protect the nation's natural resources. While many of his contemporaries saw government intervention in land management as unnecessary, Roosevelt believed it was the government's responsibility to ensure that resources were used sustainably. He understood that industries like timber, mining, and agriculture were crucial to the nation's economy, but he also recognized that unchecked exploitation of natural resources could lead to long-term harm. Pinchot's vision aligned with Roosevelt's, as both men believed that the government should step in to manage these resources to prevent overuse and ensure their availability for future generations. Under Roosevelt's leadership, the Forest Service grew rapidly, and the government began to regulate public lands more effectively. Pinchot's work in expanding the national forests, establishing fire prevention systems, and promoting scientific management of resources was groundbreaking. The Forest Service adopted a policy of managing forests for multiple uses, including timber production, recreation, and watershed protection, which became the cornerstone of Roosevelt's conservation policy. This approach marked a significant departure from the idea of wilderness preservation, and instead focused on sustainable use and long-term resource management. The partnership between Roosevelt and Pinchot was not without challenges. They faced opposition from powerful industries, such as the timber and mining sectors, which saw conservation efforts as a threat to their profits. Despite this resistance, Roosevelt and Pinchot remained committed to their shared vision. Their efforts created a lasting legacy that not only shaped American conservation, but also established the foundation for modern environmental management. Together, they transformed the way the United States approached its natural resources, ensuring that conservation became an integral part of the national policy framework. Their work paved the way for future generations to continue the work they had started, ensuring that the land would be managed wisely and responsibly for years to come. Founding the U.S. Forest Service. The creation of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 was one of the most significant steps in the history of American conservation, and it was a direct result of the vision and leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. At the time, the nation's forests were being rapidly depleted by uncontrolled logging and other exploitative practices. Roosevelt, deeply concerned by the state of the nation's natural resources, understood that there was an urgent need for a federal agency to manage and protect public lands. His partnership with Gifford Pinchot, a trained forester with a passion for resource management, was instrumental in making this vision a reality. Together, they built the foundation for an institution that would oversee the preservation and sustainable use of the nation's forests. Prior to the establishment of the U.S. Forest Service, public lands were managed by various federal agencies, but there was no cohesive approach to forest management. The timber industry, mining companies, and other businesses had free rein over much of the nation's land, leading to widespread destruction of forests and natural habitats. Roosevelt recognized that this unchecked exploitation could have long-term negative effects on the nation's economy, environment, and people. He believed that the government had a responsibility to step in and regulate the use of public lands to ensure they were managed properly for the benefit of future generations. The creation of the U.S. Forest Service was the result of a push to consolidate forest management under a single, dedicated agency. Roosevelt appointed Gifford Pinchot, a progressive and scientifically minded forester, to lead the new service. Pinchot's vision for conservation aligned closely with Roosevelt's belief that natural resources should be used sustainably, ensuring their availability for future generations. Pinchot's leadership in the formation of the Forest Service brought together the principles of scientific forestry with the practical need for government regulation. The new agency would oversee the protection and responsible management of millions of acres of public land, focusing on the long-term health of the nation's forests. One of the primary goals of the U.S. Forest Service was to promote the idea of sustainable resource management. Unlike the prevailing notion of the time that natural resources were to be exploited for immediate gain, the Forest Service adopted the concept of scientific management, a method of managing forests that took into account long-term ecological health and the sustainable harvest of timber and other resources. Pinchot and Roosevelt believed that forests should not be preserved in their natural state, but rather managed in a way that allowed for multiple uses, such as timber production, recreation, and watershed protection. This marked a departure from earlier conservation efforts, which focused solely on preserving wilderness areas for future generations. The establishment of the U.S. Forest Service was also significant because it represented a shift in the role of the federal government in managing natural resources. Prior to the creation of the Forest Service, the federal government had little involvement in the management of public lands, and much of the land was left open to exploitation. The Forest Service, however, became a powerful tool for the government to regulate land use and protect valuable resources. Under Roosevelt's leadership, the Forest Service grew rapidly, expanding its jurisdiction to include millions of acres of national forests and establishing a framework for land management that would endure for generations. The creation of the U.S. Forest Service marked a turning point in American environmental policy. It was the beginning of a new era of government intervention in the protection and management of natural resources. The Forest Service would go on to play a crucial role in shaping the nation's approach to conservation, influencing the development of national parks, wildlife refuges, and other public lands. Roosevelt's vision for the Forest Service laid the foundation for a system of land management that would balance economic development with environmental protection, ensuring that America's natural resources were preserved for future generations. Battling political and corporate opposition. The creation of the U.S. Forest Service and the expansion of Roosevelt's conservation efforts were not without significant opposition. While the president's vision for the responsible management of natural resources garnered widespread support from conservationists and environmentalists, it also faced fierce resistance from powerful political and corporate interests. The timber, mining, and agricultural industries saw Roosevelt's push for federal regulation and the establishment of national forests as a direct threat to their profits and economic power. These industries, which had enjoyed nearly unrestricted access to public lands, now found themselves in conflict with Roosevelt's new conservation policies. The battle between Roosevelt's conservation vision and the entrenched interests of corporate America would become one of the defining struggles of his presidency. One of the key sources of opposition came from the timber industry. Timber companies had been allowed to extract wood from public lands without much oversight, and they stood to lose significant profits under the new policies of the Forest Service. Many of the most powerful logging companies, particularly those based in the Pacific Northwest, resented the restrictions placed on their ability to freely harvest timber from federal lands. Roosevelt's decision to set aside large swaths of land as national forests, coupled with new regulations requiring sustainable logging practices, cut into the bottom line of many timber companies. These companies launched a vigorous campaign to discredit Roosevelt's policies, arguing that they would harm the economy and the livelihoods of workers in the timber industry. The mining industry, too, saw Roosevelt's conservation efforts as an obstacle to its growth. Mining companies had long operated on public lands with little regard for environmental consequences, and they were deeply concerned about the new regulations that threatened to restrict their access to valuable resources. These companies, particularly in the western United States, feared that the designation of national forests would limit their ability to extract minerals and metals. As the U.S. Forest Service worked to regulate the use of public lands, mining interests mobilized politically to block Roosevelt's efforts, often arguing that his policies would stifle economic development and harm local economies. Political opposition to Roosevelt's conservation agenda also came from within his own party. While Roosevelt had considerable support among progressive Republicans, there were many conservative members of Congress who opposed his sweeping conservation measures. These lawmakers believed that Roosevelt's policies were an overreach of federal power, and that land management should remain largely in the hands of state governments or private interests. Some even argued that the federal government had no business regulating land that was meant to be used for economic development. Roosevelt's struggle to overcome this resistance within Congress was one of the most difficult challenges of his presidency. Despite the opposition, Roosevelt remained steadfast in his commitment to conservation. He understood that the future of the nation's natural resources depended on strong government intervention, and that the long-term benefits of protecting the land far outweighed the short-term profits of exploitation. Roosevelt's ability to navigate these political and corporate challenges was key to the success of his conservation efforts. He used his bully pulpit, the power of the presidency and the media, to rally public support for his policies, arguing that the government had a duty to protect the nation's resources for the benefit of all Americans, not just a privileged few. Through public speeches, media coverage, and strategic alliances with conservation groups, Roosevelt was able to turn public opinion in favor of conservation. In the face of significant opposition, Roosevelt's determination ultimately prevailed. By the end of his presidency, he had established 150 national forests, signed into law the Antiquities Act, and laid the foundation for a new era of federal involvement in conservation. His work set a precedent for future presidents and conservation efforts, ensuring that the protection of natural resources would remain a central focus of American policy. Despite the challenges, Roosevelt's battle against political and corporate opposition solidified his legacy as one of the greatest champions of environmental conservation in American history. Chapter 3: Building the Forest Army. The creation of the U.S. Forest Service was only the first step in Theodore Roosevelt's vision for conservation. In order to manage and protect the newly established national forests, Roosevelt and his team knew they would need a dedicated force of trained individuals who could oversee the land and ensure it was used sustainably. This idea led to the establishment of what Roosevelt referred to as his Forest Army, a group of men who would work to enforce conservation policies, prevent overexploitation of resources, and maintain the health of the nation's forests. The Forest Service, under the leadership of Gifford Pinchot, would need to develop an effective system of forest management, and the men who made up the Forest Army would be the backbone of this effort. Roosevelt was determined to make sure that the men chosen to oversee the forests were not only capable, but also committed to the mission of conservation. These early forest rangers were expected to be skilled in multiple disciplines: forestry, fire management, wildlife protection, and law enforcement. Roosevelt and Pinchot both understood that managing the nation's vast and diverse forests required more than just technical knowledge. The forest rangers had to be able to deal with the political and corporate pressures that would inevitably arise as industries sought to exploit public lands. In many cases, they had to navigate tense relationships with local communities who relied on timber and other resources for their livelihood. The recruitment process for the Forest Service was challenging, as the idea of federal employees overseeing vast tracts of land was new and controversial. Many Americans had grown up with the idea that public lands should be open to anyone for use, and the notion of government control over these areas was met with resistance. Nevertheless, Roosevelt and Pinchot pressed on, recruiting men who were dedicated to the cause. These rangers, often young and idealistic, took on a wide range of duties, from patrolling remote wilderness areas to enforcing fire prevention laws. They were tasked with educating the public about the benefits of conservation and ensuring that the land was used responsibly. The forest rangers also faced a growing set of challenges as the timber industry continued to exert pressure on the federal government to loosen regulations. Despite the opposition, the Forest Army stood firm in their commitment to conservation. One of the most important aspects of their work was fire management, as wildfires were a constant threat to the forests. The early rangers developed strategies to fight fires, including controlled burns, creating fire breaks, and using early detection methods. Fire management became one of the primary responsibilities of the Forest Service, as Roosevelt and Pinchot both understood the devastating impact that uncontrolled wildfires could have on the nation's forests. The Forest Army also played a crucial role in educating the public about the importance of conservation. As part of their duties, rangers would often speak to local communities, explaining the benefits of responsible land management and the need for sustainable practices. This outreach helped build support for Roosevelt's conservation policies and laid the foundation for a national conservation ethic that would grow in the years to come. By the end of Roosevelt's presidency, the Forest Army had established itself as a vital part of the nation's conservation efforts. The Forest Service had grown significantly, and the rangers who made up this force had helped to protect millions of acres of national forests. Roosevelt's vision of a national system for managing natural resources was taking shape, and the Forest Army played a key role in ensuring that his legacy would endure. Life of the early rangers. The life of an early forest ranger in the U.S. Forest Service was far from easy. In the early 1900s, these men, often referred to as the Forest Army, were tasked with the monumental job of managing and protecting America's newly designated national forests. Many of these rangers were young, energetic, and deeply committed to the ideals of conservation, but they faced numerous challenges as they worked to implement Roosevelt's vision for the nation's natural resources. Most rangers worked in remote, rugged areas far from the reach of modern amenities, where they had to rely on their resourcefulness and resilience to perform their duties. The rangers were assigned to patrol vast tracts of land, often covering hundreds or even thousands of acres. Their primary responsibility was to enforce conservation policies, including preventing illegal logging, hunting, and grazing on national forest lands. They had to be vigilant, always on the lookout for signs of exploitation. This often meant long, solitary hours spent walking through dense forests, climbing mountains, and crossing rivers in all types of weather conditions. The work was physically demanding, and the rangers had little in the way of comfort or luxury. The forest was their office, and they had to be prepared for the worst at any given moment. In addition to protecting the forests from exploitation, rangers were responsible for managing and maintaining the land. They had to create fire breaks, maintain trails, and ensure that wildlife habitats were not disturbed. Fire prevention and control were especially important, as wildfires were a constant threat to the forests. Rangers had to learn to recognize the signs of an impending fire, and many became trained in firefighting techniques, including setting controlled burns to prevent larger, more destructive wildfires. The role of fire management became one of the most critical aspects of their work. Socially and geographically isolated, the early rangers lived a life that was often cut off from the communities they served. Many rangers lived in small cabins or makeshift shelters deep within the forests, and they were often stationed in areas far from towns or other people. This isolation was part of the job, and it created a sense of camaraderie among the rangers who worked together in these remote locations. Despite the hardships, many rangers found the work fulfilling, driven by the sense that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were the stewards of the land, protecting it for future generations. The early rangers were also tasked with educating the public about conservation. They often worked with local communities, helping people understand the importance of sustainable land use and the need to protect natural resources. This outreach was crucial in building support for the growing conservation movement, as many people in rural areas still relied on the land for their livelihoods. The rangers' role as educators helped to foster a broader cultural shift toward a more responsible relationship with nature. Despite the harsh conditions, the early forest rangers played an essential role in the success of Roosevelt's conservation efforts. Their dedication to the protection of the nation's forests laid the foundation for future generations of land stewards. Over time, the U.S. Forest Service would grow and evolve, but the spirit of those early rangers committed to preserving the land remained at the heart of the agency's mission. Challenges of patrolling the wilderness. Patrolling the vast and rugged landscapes of America's national forests in the early 1900s was a formidable task. The forest rangers, the men who were entrusted with this responsibility, faced a range of challenges that tested both their physical endurance and their determination to protect the land. With limited resources, primitive equipment, and often isolated from society, these early rangers had to rely on their ingenuity, resilience, and a deep sense of purpose as they navigated the difficulties of wilderness patrol. The first major challenge was the sheer size of the land they were responsible for. National forests were often immense, covering thousands of square miles, and the rangers were tasked with patrolling these expansive areas. The terrain itself was daunting: dense forests, steep mountains, rugged valleys, and remote rivers. The forests were difficult to navigate, and the rangers had to cover long distances on foot or horseback, sometimes for days at a time, to ensure that the land was being protected. Their work required a high level of physical fitness, as the rangers were constantly trekking through difficult conditions, often far from any roads or established trails. Isolation was another significant challenge faced by the early rangers. Many of them were stationed in remote outposts, far from towns or other communities. The isolation could be both physically and emotionally taxing. Rangers often lived alone in small cabins or makeshift shelters, relying on supplies brought in by horseback or the rare visit from a fellow ranger. They were disconnected from the outside world, with little in the way of communication or social interaction. This solitude, while a necessary part of the job, created an environment where rangers had to be self-sufficient, capable of solving problems and handling emergencies on their own. The threat of poaching and illegal logging was a constant concern for the rangers. With valuable timber and wildlife at stake, unscrupulous individuals often trespassed on national forest land to harvest timber or hunt game illegally. The rangers were tasked with catching these lawbreakers, which was not an easy job. They had to patrol vast areas, sometimes in difficult weather conditions, looking for signs of illegal activity. It was a dangerous and unpredictable job, as many poachers were armed and determined to evade the law. Rangers often found themselves in confrontational situations, and there were numerous instances where they had to act decisively to stop illegal activities. Another challenge faced by the early rangers was the constant threat of wildfires. As large sections of the national forest were made up of dense forests, the risk of fire was ever present. Rangers had to be vigilant, watching for signs of fire and preventing the spread of flames. They were often the first responders to wildfires, and their ability to quickly contain a fire was crucial to preventing widespread destruction. In many cases, they had to fight fires using rudimentary tools and techniques, including digging fire breaks and setting controlled burns to limit the spread of flames. Firefighting in such a vast and unpredictable environment was a task that required both skill and courage. The challenges of patrolling the wilderness were immense, but the early forest rangers embraced their mission with a sense of duty and determination. They understood that their work was vital not only to the preservation of the forests, but also to the future of the nation's natural resources. Despite the hardships, these men forged a legacy of conservation that would shape the future of the U.S. Forest Service and set the stage for future generations of rangers and land stewards. Preparing for the unexpected. The life of an early forest ranger in the U.S. Forest Service was one filled with unpredictability. With vast rugged lands to patrol, These rangers had to constantly be prepared for unexpected challenges, ranging from natural disasters to human-caused threats. The wilderness was a harsh and unforgiving environment, and the job required more than just technical knowledge and physical stamina. It demanded the ability to think quickly and adapt to ever-changing conditions. The unpredictable nature of the land and the tasks required the rangers to be highly resourceful, ready for anything that could come their way. One of the most pressing challenges rangers faced was the constant threat of wildfires. The nation's forests, especially in the West, were densely packed with dry timber and underbrush, which made them highly susceptible to fires, particularly during the hot, dry summers. Rangers had to always be on the lookout for early signs of fire, including smoke, scorched areas, or unusual weather patterns. When a fire broke out, it could spread rapidly, engulfing entire sections of the forest before help could arrive. The rangers had to act quickly and decisively, often with limited resources. They would use fire breaks, controlled burns, and rudimentary firefighting tools to fight the blaze. The unpredictability of wildfires meant that rangers never knew when they might need to drop everything and respond to a dangerous situation. Another unpredictable element of the job was the constant threat of illegal activities within the national forests. Poaching, logging, and trespassing were ongoing issues that rangers had to monitor. Timber companies and hunters often ignored the laws protecting the forests, and it was up to the rangers to catch them in the act. These encounters could be dangerous, as many poachers and illegal loggers were armed and willing to resist arrest. Rangers had to be prepared for confrontations, sometimes with little backup, as they worked in remote areas far from law enforcement. The element of surprise could turn any patrol into a potentially violent encounter, and rangers had to be ready to handle it with caution and authority. Rangers also had to prepare for the unexpected in terms of the weather. The wilderness was an unforgiving place, and the rangers often worked in conditions that ranged from extreme heat to heavy snowstorms. Unpredictable weather could create dangerous situations, whether it was flooding from sudden storms or freezing temperatures that made travel impossible. Rangers were required to be self-sufficient, carrying enough supplies to survive extended periods in the field, but they had to rely on their knowledge of the land to navigate through conditions that were constantly changing. Whether it was a flash flood, a snowstorm, or an intense heat wave, the rangers had to be ready for anything nature could throw at them. The remoteness of many of the areas they patrolled also presented challenges. Rangers often worked alone or in small teams, miles away from the nearest town or support system. This isolation meant that they had to be skilled in survival tactics, able to navigate through dense forests, and equipped with the tools necessary to fix equipment or deal with injuries. With few resources at their disposal, these early rangers had to make do with what they had, using their ingenuity and knowledge of the land to solve problems on the fly. Preparing for the unexpected became second nature to the rangers of the U.S. Forest Service. They learned to anticipate danger, adapt to unforeseen circumstances, and think on their feet. The challenges they faced were immense, but it was their ability to rise to these challenges that made the early forest rangers an integral part of the success of Roosevelt's conservation efforts. Their determination to protect the land, no matter the obstacle, laid the foundation for the future of the U.S. Forest Service and the nation's approach to conservation. Chapter 4: Sparks in the Forest. The summer of 1910 marked a critical turning point in the history of the U.S. Forest Service and in the broader conservation movement. The nation's forests, already under the care of Roosevelt's Forest Service, were about to face one of their most devastating threats yet, the Great Fire of 1910. This fire, which would burn over 3 million acres of forest land across the northern Rockies, would test the very system that had been put in place to protect these natural resources. It was a stark reminder of the unpredictable forces of nature and the limits of human intervention. The conditions leading up to the fire were alarming. The year 1910 was one of the driest on record, and the forests were tinder dry. The region had experienced several years of drought, which left the forest floors covered with dead wood and other dry debris, making it especially vulnerable to fire. Adding to the risk was the booming timber industry, which had expanded rapidly, putting more strain on the forests. The U.S. Forest Service was in its early years of operation, and while they had made great strides in forest management, they were still learning how to cope with such an overwhelming crisis. When the fire ignited in August 1910, it spread with terrifying speed. Strong winds fueled the flames, pushing them across miles of rugged terrain that was difficult to access. The Forest Service, still developing its firefighting strategies, struggled to keep the fire under control. The agency had limited resources, and the early forest rangers, despite their training and dedication, were unprepared for such an overwhelming blaze. The fire burned everything in its path, consuming not just the forests but towns, homes, and lives. Thousands of people were forced to flee, and dozens of rangers and civilians perished in the flames. The fire's devastation was enormous, but it also marked a moment of transformation for the Forest Service. In the wake of the disaster, the agency recognized the need to improve its firefighting capabilities and resources. The fire demonstrated just how vulnerable the forests were to natural forces, and it underscored the importance of the work the Forest Service was doing to protect the land. Although the fire was a tragedy, it led to significant advancements in fire management and prevention. The Forest Service increased its focus on fire suppression and began to implement more sophisticated strategies for combating wildfires. The Great Fire of 1910 was a defining moment in the history of American conservation. It forced the Forest Service to confront the realities of forest management in a new way, and provided a critical lesson in the challenges of preserving the nation's natural resources. The fire's aftermath also strengthened the resolve of the rangers, conservationists, and citizens who had long been committed to protecting the country's forests. The devastation was a stark reminder of the fragility of nature, but it also demonstrated the resilience of those who worked to safeguard it. Conditions leading to the Great Fire. The Great Fire of 1910, one of the most devastating wildfires in American history, did not erupt overnight. It was the result of a combination of environmental, human, and economic factors that converged in the summer of that year. The conditions leading up to the fire were marked by years of drought, overexploitation of forest resources, and a rapidly expanding timber industry, all of which created a volatile mix. The U.S. Forest Service, still in its formative years, was tasked with managing the country's national forests, but it had yet to fully understand the scale and intensity of the challenge it would soon face. The first major factor contributing to the fire was the unusually dry weather that plagued the western United States in the years leading up to 1910. The region had suffered from drought conditions for several years, and by the summer of 1910, the forests were tinder dry. A combination of low rainfall and high temperatures left the forest floor covered with dead leaves, branches, and fallen trees, creating the perfect fuel for a wildfire. The dryness was compounded by strong winds that began to pick up in August, pushing the flames even further and causing them to spread at an alarming rate. Another critical factor in the conditions leading to the fire was the overharvesting of timber. The logging industry had been booming, particularly in the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Rockies. Timber companies had clear-cut vast stretches of forest land, removing not just the valuable trees, but also leaving behind large quantities of dry debris. This created an environment where the forest was highly susceptible to fire. Additionally, the U.S. Forest Service, still a young organization, lacked the resources and infrastructure to prevent or manage fires on such a large scale. While the Forest Service had made strides in protecting public lands, it had not yet developed the sophisticated firefighting techniques or manpower necessary to deal with a blaze of such magnitude. As the fire began to spread in the summer of 1910, the rangers and firefighters faced another challenge: the lack of coordination and preparedness. The Forest Service, though rapidly growing, was not fully equipped to handle the rapidly expanding fire. Early firefighting tactics were rudimentary, relying on hand tools and fire breaks that were often insufficient to contain the flames. The blaze spread quickly, fueled by the dry conditions and the strong winds, leaving little time for the rangers to respond effectively. These conditions, combined with the ongoing challenges of forest management and wildfire prevention, led to the catastrophic fire that would burn for days, consuming over 3 million acres of forest. The aftermath of the fire forced the Forest Service to reevaluate its strategies and priorities, leading to critical advancements in fire management techniques. The Great Fire of 1910 was a wake-up call for the Forest Service and the nation, highlighting the urgent need for better planning, resources, and a deeper understanding of the forces that shape the American wilderness. The Summer of Drought. The summer of 1910 was marked by an extreme drought that set the stage for one of the most destructive wildfires in U.S. history. Across the western United States, rainfall was sparse, and temperatures soared to record highs. The dry conditions created a tinderbox environment, where the forests were not only parched, but highly vulnerable to ignition. The lack of rain over the preceding months, combined with the heat of the summer, had caused vegetation to dry out completely, leaving behind a volatile mix of dead branches, leaves, and underbrush that could easily ignite. This widespread drought created the ideal conditions for a wildfire to break out and spread rapidly. The drought was not an isolated event, but part of a larger weather pattern that affected much of the western U.S. for several years leading up to the fire. Throughout the region, rivers and streams ran lower than usual, and the land was cracked and dry. In addition, the intense heat during the summer months only made the situation worse. These dry conditions were particularly severe in the northern Rockies, which had seen little rainfall and were hit hardest by the drought. By the time the fire ignited in August, the ground was so dry that even the smallest spark could set off an inferno. The drought's effects on the region were not limited to the dry vegetation. The already fragile ecosystems were weakened, making them less resistant to fire. Wildlife habitats were disrupted, and the forest itself, once rich in diverse plant life, began to show signs of distress. The absence of moisture meant that trees, shrubs, and grasses could not regenerate as they usually would. Even the larger trees, the lifeblood of the timber industry, became more susceptible to diseases and pests, further weakening the forest. This added layer of vulnerability left the land in a highly fragile state, making it difficult for the U.S. Forest Service to manage the land effectively. As the drought continued, the threat of fire became increasingly imminent. The dry conditions were a warning that any spark, whether from a lightning strike or human activity, could ignite a fire that would be nearly impossible to contain. By the summer of 1910, the drought had left the forests in a state where even controlled burns, once a common firefighting technique, became risky and difficult to manage. The forest rangers, who were tasked with protecting the land, were ill-equipped to handle a fire in these extreme conditions. The summer of drought thus set the stage for the Great Fire of 1910, creating a perfect storm of environmental, human, and climatic factors that would lead to one of the most catastrophic fires the nation had ever seen. The devastating effects of the drought underscored the vulnerability of the land, signaling the urgent need for more advanced fire prevention and management techniques. Warning signs and ignored dangers. As the summer of 1910 progressed, warning signs of the impending disaster were everywhere, but many went unheeded or were downplayed by those responsible for managing the land. Across the western United States, the combination of extreme drought, high temperatures, and winds was already creating conditions ripe for a devastating fire. Yet despite the clear risks, the magnitude of the danger was not fully recognized by the authorities and industries involved. This failure to act on early signs would prove to be one of the key factors that allowed the fire to spread uncontrollably when it eventually ignited. One of the most significant warning signs was the unusually dry conditions throughout the region. The drought that had gripped the area for months had already dried up rivers and streams, and the forest floor was covered with a heavy layer of dead leaves, branches, and other debris. The lack of rainfall had caused the trees and underbrush to become highly flammable, making the forest vulnerable to ignition. Despite this, many people, including some within the U.S. Forest Service, did not fully appreciate how dangerous the situation had become. There was a prevailing belief that wildfires were a natural part of the forest cycle and could be controlled through standard firefighting techniques. However, no one anticipated the scale and ferocity of the fire that would soon ravage the region. Another warning sign was the increasing frequency of smaller fires across the forests in the weeks leading up to the Great Fire. Fires had already broken out in multiple locations, and many of them had spread quickly due to the dry conditions. These smaller fires should have served as an alarm bell, signaling the need for heightened vigilance and more extensive firefighting resources. However, the Forest Service, still a relatively new agency, lacked the infrastructure and personnel to respond to every threat. Ranger stations were understaffed, and many areas remained unpatrolled due to the vastness of the land. As a result, these early fires were often left to burn out on their own, or were controlled too late to prevent further spread. In addition, there was a significant underestimation of the potential power of wildfire in such extreme conditions. While fires were common in the forests, the idea that a fire could burn across millions of acres was not something that had been fully considered. The Forest Service was equipped for managing localized fires, but the rapid spread of a massive blaze like the one that would soon ignite was beyond their experience. The scale of the fire was compounded by the strong winds that picked up in the days before the fire, pushing the flames faster and further. These winds turned what might have been a manageable fire into an uncontrollable inferno. Ultimately, the dangers were ignored or underestimated until it was too late. By the time the fire began in earnest in August, the conditions were already catastrophic. The dry vegetation, the lack of preparedness, and the limited resources of the Forest Service all combined to make it impossible to contain the fire before it grew out of control. The failure to heed the warning signs and act decisively was a critical factor in the devastation that followed. In hindsight, it became clear that the Great Fire of 1910 was not just a product of natural conditions, but of human failure to recognize and address the mounting dangers that had been building for months. Chapter 5: The Firestorm Unleashed. The Great Fire of 1910 erupted with terrifying speed and ferocity, transforming the landscape of the northern Rockies in a matter of days. What had been a series of small, isolated fires sparked by the dry summer conditions quickly morphed into an unstoppable inferno, sweeping across over 3 million acres of forest. It was a firestorm unlike anything the U.S. Forest Service had ever faced, and the effects were devastating. The fire spread with a relentless, all-consuming force, fueled by strong winds, high temperatures, and the abundant dry vegetation that had been created by years of drought. It began in early August, when lightning strikes ignited several fires in the forests of northeastern Washington, Idaho, and Montana. These fires, already fanned by the drought conditions, quickly merged, creating one massive blaze. As the flames spread, the rangers and firefighters on the ground realized that they were facing an entirely new level of danger. The fire moved faster than anticipated, with the winds pushing the flames across vast stretches of forest. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with smoke, making it nearly impossible to see or breathe. The terrain itself, rugged, mountainous, and covered with dense timber, made it difficult for firefighters to reach the flames or build effective fire breaks. With the fire growing by the hour, the Forest Service's early response efforts were quickly overwhelmed. Rangers and firefighters, many of them young and inexperienced, struggled to control the blaze. Firefighting techniques, while effective on smaller fires, were inadequate in the face of such a massive, uncontrollable force. As the flames swept through entire communities, thousands of people were forced to flee, with entire towns being consumed by the fire. The Forest Service, despite their best efforts, was unable to prevent the destruction, and many of the rangers found themselves fighting for their own survival. The firestorm's intensity was staggering. At its peak, the fire spread across hundreds of miles, devouring everything in its path. The combination of dry conditions, high winds, and the vast scale of the fire made it impossible to contain. Some areas were completely wiped out, with forests reduced to ash, wildlife lost, and the landscape forever changed. The fire not only destroyed the forest, but also had far-reaching consequences for the future of conservation and fire management. When the flames finally began to subside, it was clear that the Great Fire of 1910 had left an indelible mark on the nation. The scale of the devastation was unprecedented, and the fire would serve as a powerful reminder of the unpredictable and uncontrollable nature of wildfires. The aftermath of the firestorm would force the U.S. Forest Service to reevaluate its strategies for managing and preventing wildfires, shaping the future of American forest management for decades to come. Outbreak of the Big Burn. The outbreak of the Big Burn in August 1910 marked the beginning of one of the most catastrophic wildfire events in American history. It began in the remote forests of the Northern Rockies, a region already suffering from extreme drought conditions. The initial sparks came from lightning strikes, which ignited a series of small fires in the dense forests of northeastern Washington, Idaho, and Montana. These fires, which had been manageable on their own, quickly grew out of control as the wind picked up and temperatures soared, creating the perfect storm for a devastating blaze. What started as a few isolated fires rapidly merged into a massive inferno that would burn over 3 million acres of forest in just a few days. As the flames spread, the rangers and firefighters of the U.S. Forest Service faced an overwhelming challenge. The fire grew with astonishing speed, fueled by the dry timber and underbrush created by the years of drought. The terrain, which was rugged and difficult to navigate, made it even harder for the firefighters to contain the fire. As the fire roared across the landscape, the combination of dry vegetation and strong winds pushed the flames further into the wilderness. The fire was not just spreading, it was racing across vast stretches of land with a relentless force. In the beginning, the response was slow, with the Forest Service struggling to gather enough manpower and resources to combat the fire. Rangers on the ground found themselves unable to stop the flames, and the usual firefighting techniques, such as creating fire breaks or controlling smaller fires, were ineffective. The fire's speed and scale were unlike anything they had encountered before. As the fire grew, so did its destructive power, consuming everything in its path. Entire forests were wiped out, wildlife was destroyed, and communities were left in ruins. It was clear that the fire was beyond the control of the U.S. Forest Service, and the situation soon became a race to save lives rather than the land. The fire's spread was marked by chaotic scenes as people, including thousands of firefighters, tried to flee or fight back. Many of the forest rangers were forced to abandon their posts and escape the advancing flames, and several lost their lives in the process. The firestorm was a terrifying sight, with towering walls of flames consuming the forest, and the air thick with smoke. By the time the fire finally began to subside, the damage had already been done. The Big Burn had caused unprecedented destruction, leaving a lasting impact on both the land and the future of fire management in the U.S. Forest Service. Heroes and chaos in the flames. As the Great Fire of 1910, known as the Big Burn, raged across the Northern Rockies, the chaos and destruction it caused were matched only by the courage of those who risked their lives to fight it. The firestorm, which had quickly spread across millions of acres of land, overwhelmed the efforts of the U.S. Forest Service and local communities. But amidst the smoke and flames, countless acts of bravery and selflessness emerged. Forest rangers, firefighters, and even civilians stepped up in an attempt to contain the blaze and protect both lives and property. The Big Burn became a testament to human resilience in the face of nature's most uncontrollable force. The heroes of the firestorm were the men and women who worked tirelessly to battle the inferno. Many were Forest Service rangers who, despite being vastly outnumbered and under-equipped, refused to abandon their posts. These rangers had been trained to fight smaller fires, but the magnitude of the Big Burn was beyond anything they had prepared for. As the fire spread rapidly, many of the rangers found themselves in life-threatening situations, often working long hours in dangerous conditions. Some took desperate measures to stop the fire's progress, using fire breaks, controlled burns, and even dynamite to create barriers in the path of the flames. These brave men did everything they could to slow the fire's advance, but the scale and speed of the blaze made it nearly impossible to contain. One of the most harrowing stories from the fire was that of a group of firefighters trapped by the flames. As the fire approached, they made the decision to dig in and try to protect themselves by creating a firebreak, but they were overwhelmed by the flames. Many of them fought desperately to escape, and some tragically lost their lives in the attempt. Their courage and sacrifice became emblematic of the bravery exhibited by so many others caught in the firestorm. Amid the chaos, there was also confusion and disarray. The sheer size of the fire made communication nearly impossible, and the lack of coordination between various firefighting efforts added to the confusion. Many rangers were cut off from their stations, and entire communities were left vulnerable as the firestorm tore through. The overwhelming nature of the disaster made it clear that the firefighting techniques used at the time were insufficient to deal with such a massive and uncontrollable blaze. In the end, while the fire left destruction in its wake, it also highlighted the heroism and determination of those who fought it. Their efforts, although unable to prevent the destruction, were a testament to their unwavering commitment to protecting the land and saving lives. The heroes of the Big Burn were not just those who fought the fire, but also those who survived to share the story of the chaos, the sacrifice, and the courage displayed in the face of nature's fury. The battle to save Wallace. As the Great Fire of 1910 raged across the northern Rockies, one town found itself caught in the path of the inferno, Wallace, Idaho. Located in a valley surrounded by dense forests, Wallace was a small but thriving community that depended on the natural resources of the surrounding area. As the fire advanced, Wallace became one of the last strongholds in the region, and the battle to save the town would test the mettle of the U.S. Forest Service rangers, firefighters, and residents alike. The town had already experienced the growing threat of the fire as it spread across the forests surrounding Wallace. The dry conditions and high winds had caused the flames to grow exponentially, and the fire seemed to be unstoppable. With the fire closing in, local residents and the U.S. Forest Service rangers were faced with a difficult decision. Should they attempt to defend the town or abandon it to the flames? As the firestorm approached, the stakes could not have been higher, and the race to save Wallace became a desperate fight against time and nature. Forest Service rangers, already stretched thin by the overwhelming number of fires breaking out across the region, were the first to step in. They worked tirelessly, creating firebreaks and attempting to direct the fire away from the town. But the winds were relentless, and the flames were advancing rapidly, fueled by the dry timber and underbrush that had been left to dry in the wake of the summer drought. As the fire reached the outskirts of Wallace, it seemed like all hope was lost. The flames were racing toward the town, and firefighters were faced with the near-impossible task of holding back a force of nature that had already consumed millions of acres of land. In the midst of the chaos, the residents of Wallace refused to surrender without a fight. Led by local officials and guided by the rangers, they began to take matters into their own hands. The townspeople dug firebreaks, moved belongings to safer areas, and used whatever tools they had to help fight the fire. They worked together, knowing that their only chance of survival was through unity and quick action. The battle to save Wallace was not just a fight against the fire, it was a struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. Against all expectations, the town managed to survive the onslaught of the Big Burn. Thanks to the combined efforts of the Forest Service rangers, firefighters, and the brave residents of Wallace, the town was spared from total destruction. The fire eventually passed through, but the experience left a deep impact on the community. It was a reminder of the dangers posed by wildfires and the critical importance of preparation and community solidarity in the face of disaster. Wallace's survival became a symbol of hope and resilience, showing that even in the face of the most devastating forces of nature, determination and cooperation could make all the difference. Chapter 6: Aftermath and Reckoning. When the flames of the Great Fire of 1910 finally began to subside, the vast and devastating scope of the destruction was revealed. The fire had consumed more than 3 million acres of forest land, decimating entire ecosystems, wiping out wildlife, and leaving communities in ruins. The U.S. Forest Service, which had struggled to contain the fire as it raged out of control, now faced the grim task of assessing the damage and dealing with the aftermath of the disaster. The fire had forced a reckoning for the Forest Service and for the country as a whole, one that would reshape the way forests were managed and how wildfires were fought in the future. The immediate physical impact of the fire was staggering. The forests, once teeming with life, were reduced to ash. Entire swaths of timberland had been destroyed, leaving behind only charred remnants. For the people who lived in the affected areas, the loss was even more profound. In towns like Wallace, Idaho, and others caught in the path of the flames, homes, businesses, and infrastructure had been obliterated. The fire had displaced thousands, and many people were left without homes or livelihoods. The emotional toll was just as severe as the physical destruction, as communities were forced to rebuild from the ground up, not just their buildings but their lives. The U.S. Forest Service, despite its efforts to control the fire, was left to face harsh criticism. The sheer scale of the fire exposed the agency's limitations, and many questioned whether it was adequately prepared for such a catastrophe. The Forest Service, which had been founded just a few years earlier, was still a young and evolving organization. While it had successfully established numerous national forests and implemented early conservation policies, it was ill-equipped to handle a fire of such magnitude. The fire's destruction underscored the need for better planning, more resources, and more trained personnel to deal with the growing threat of wildfires. In the aftermath, there was a reckoning not only for the Forest Service, but for the nation's approach to forest management. The fire highlighted the fragile balance between human development and nature. It forced the government to confront the realities of forest protection and fire prevention on a scale that had never been seen before. The Forest Service would have to evolve quickly, adopting new firefighting techniques, strengthening its infrastructure, and preparing for future disasters. The Great Fire of 1910 marked a turning point in how America viewed and managed its natural resources. It was a harsh lesson in the unpredictability of nature and the limits of human intervention. The tragedy of the fire, however, also led to important changes in policy and practice that would shape the future of conservation and wildfire management. The lessons learned in the aftermath of the Big Burn would guide the U.S. Forest Service for decades, making it a more resilient and capable institution. While the scars of the fire would remain, the country's commitment to protecting its forests grew stronger in its wake. Lives lost and towns destroyed. The Great Fire of 1910 was a catastrophe that not only left behind a scarred landscape, but also took a heavy toll on human lives. As the fire swept through the northern Rockies, it destroyed towns, ravaged forests, and left thousands of people in its wake, grieving for what had been lost. In its path, it claimed not only property, but also the lives of civilians, firefighters, and forest rangers, making it one of the deadliest and most destructive wildfires in American history. The fire, which had already consumed millions of acres of forest, soon turned its focus to the communities that dotted the landscape. Some towns were completely overwhelmed by the advancing flames, leaving nothing behind but rubble and ash. Wallace, Idaho, one of the towns caught in the fire's path, managed to survive, but many others weren't as lucky. Cities like Grand Forks and several smaller towns found themselves directly in the path of the inferno. Residents, many of whom had little time to prepare or evacuate, lost their homes, their businesses, and often their livelihoods. The fire moved so quickly that it was difficult for people to escape or save anything from the flames. Entire communities vanished in mere hours, their futures uncertain as they were forced to rebuild from the ground up. Amid the devastation, the loss of life was deeply felt. While the exact number of lives lost remains uncertain, it is known that dozens perished in the flames. Many of these victims were firefighters and forest rangers who had been working tirelessly to fight the fire, risking their lives to protect the land and people they served. In some cases, rangers were caught by the fire and forced to make desperate attempts to survive, with several dying in the line of duty. Firefighters from across the region, many volunteers, joined the battle against the inferno, but the scale of the fire proved too much for even the most seasoned crews. Their bravery, however, became a defining element of the fire's aftermath, with many remembered as heroes who gave their lives to protect others. The loss of life and property from the fire also had a profound psychological impact on the people of the region. For those who lost loved ones or saw their homes and communities destroyed, the emotional toll was heavy. Entire ways of life were disrupted, and many struggled to come to terms with the devastation. As the fire was brought under control, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, and rebuilding would take years. The destruction left by the fire would resonate for generations, forcing communities, state governments, and the Forest Service to reassess their approach to fire prevention, forest management, and disaster response. The fire had claimed lives, destroyed homes, and left a deep scar on the land, but it also became a catalyst for change in the way America handled wildfires. National reaction to the disaster. The aftermath of the Great Fire of 1910 sent shockwaves through the nation, prompting widespread concern and outrage. As the firestorm ravaged the northern Rockies, consuming millions of acres of forest, towns, and lives, the disaster became a focal point for national discussion about the management of public lands, the role of the U.S. Forest Service, and the country's approach to wildfire prevention. The scale of the devastation was unprecedented, and as the smoke cleared, the public reaction was one of shock, grief, and a sense of urgency to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. In the immediate wake of the fire, the country was gripped by the loss of life and property. The destruction was immense, and the media widely covered the devastation. Newspapers across the nation reported on the fire's deadly impact, focusing not only on the widespread destruction of forests and homes, but also on the bravery of the firefighters and forest rangers who had risked their lives to fight the flames. Public outcry followed, as people began questioning why the fire had spread so quickly and why the Forest Service had been unable to contain it. The scale of the fire made it clear that something had to change in how the nation managed its forests and responded to wildfires. As the national conversation evolved, a sense of accountability emerged. Many criticized the U.S. Forest Service for its lack of preparedness and resources, pointing out that the fire had exposed serious flaws in fire management and forest preservation efforts. The Forest Service, which had been growing in influence under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, was now under intense scrutiny. There was a growing call for more funding, better trained personnel, and stronger fire prevention measures to avoid future disasters. While the Forest Service was still in its infancy, the fire's aftermath highlighted the need for more comprehensive strategies to protect the nation's natural resources. At the same time, the national reaction also led to an increased awareness of the importance of conservation. The fire reminded people that the land, though vast and seemingly indestructible, was fragile and could be easily destroyed by human neglect or natural forces. This realization sparked renewed support for conservation and led to a stronger national commitment to protecting the country's forests and natural landscapes. The fire was a harsh lesson, but it also became a catalyst for change, inspiring the federal government to take more active measures in managing public lands. In the years following the Big Burn, the Forest Service would receive increased funding, and wildfire management strategies would evolve. The fire became a turning point in the history of American conservation, driving home the need for better preparedness and a more sustainable approach to managing the nation's forests. The national reaction to the disaster would ultimately shape the future of wildfire prevention, forest management, and the overall conservation movement in the United States. The political fallout. The Great Fire of 1910 not only left a physical scar on the land, but also ignited a political firestorm that would have lasting consequences for the U.S. Forest Service and the broader conservation movement. The devastation caused by the fire, which destroyed millions of acres of forest land and claimed numerous lives, raised difficult questions about government responsibility, the effectiveness of forest management, and the preparedness of the U.S. Forest Service. In the aftermath, politicians, public officials, and citizens alike wrestled with the implications of the disaster, and the political fallout would shape the future of American land management for years to come. One of the immediate political effects of the fire was intense scrutiny of the U.S. Forest Service. Despite its efforts to protect the land, the scale of the fire exposed significant weaknesses in the agency's ability to handle such a massive disaster. Many critics pointed out that the Forest Service lacked the resources and manpower to effectively combat the fire. The rapid spread of the flames, coupled with the lack of proper firefighting techniques and equipment, highlighted the need for reform within the agency. The fire underscored the fact that the young Forest Service, though guided by the principles of conservation, was still ill-prepared to manage a disaster of such magnitude. The political fallout from the fire also centered around questions of government intervention. Many in the timber and mining industries, who had long enjoyed easy access to public lands, saw the growing power of the Forest Service as a threat to their business interests. The fire provided an opportunity for these industries to argue that the government should not be responsible for managing vast tracts of land, especially if it was not able to protect them from such a devastating disaster. Some politicians, particularly those with ties to industry, seized on the fire as evidence that the government should scale back its control over natural resources and leave the management of forests to private interests. These arguments would fuel debates in Congress over the proper role of the federal government in land management and conservation. On the other hand, the fire also galvanized political support for conservation and stronger regulation of public lands. Many progressive politicians, particularly those aligned with the conservation movement, saw the fire as a wake-up call about the importance of protecting the nation's natural resources. In response to the fire's devastation, there was a push for greater federal involvement in managing forests and preventing future disasters. Support for the Forest Service grew, as did the recognition that federal management was essential for the long-term health of the nation's forests. This period of political turmoil ultimately led to greater investments in firefighting infrastructure, more stringent regulations on land use, and a more aggressive approach to conservation. The political fallout from the Great Fire of 1910 ultimately paved the way for a more robust and proactive federal approach to forest management. The fire's aftermath exposed weaknesses in the system, but it also spurred reforms that would strengthen the Forest Service and its ability to protect the nation's natural resources. The political debates ignited by the fire would influence policy decisions for years to come, reinforcing the idea that conservation and responsible land management were not only important for the environment, but for the nation's future economic and social stability. Chapter 7: Legacy of the Flames. The Great Fire of 1910 left a profound and lasting legacy on both the land it destroyed and the institutions tasked with protecting it. Though the fire had caused unprecedented destruction, its aftermath led to significant changes in how the U.S. Forest Service approached fire management and conservation. The lessons learned from the disaster shaped the future of the Forest Service and had a lasting impact on environmental policies across the country. The fire's legacy also extended beyond the government to the public, as it sparked a broader recognition of the need to protect the nation's natural resources for future generations. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the U.S. Forest Service faced pressure to evolve and adapt. The scale of the disaster exposed critical flaws in the agency's ability to manage wildfires and protect public lands. The fire highlighted the need for better preparedness, improved firefighting techniques, and more resources to deal with large-scale disasters. As a result, the Forest Service began to invest heavily in fire management, developing more advanced firefighting equipment, creating specialized training programs, and improving coordination between local, state, and federal agencies. The agency also began to focus more on fire prevention, emphasizing the importance of controlled burns and fire breaks to limit the spread of future wildfires. The fire also had a major impact on public policy. The devastation caused by the Big Burn underscored the importance of conservation and the responsible management of natural resources. In the years following the fire, the public support for conservation grew stronger, leading to the establishment of additional national parks, wildlife refuges, and protected lands. The fire had made it clear that natural resources were not limitless, and that unchecked exploitation of the land could lead to irreversible harm. The fire's legacy spurred the expansion of the national park system and increased federal involvement in conservation efforts, setting the stage for the modern environmental movement. The fire also had a lasting impact on the way Americans viewed wildfires. Before the Big Burn, many people saw wildfires as natural events that were simply part of the forest ecosystem. However, the scale of the 1910 fire made it clear that wildfires could be catastrophic, and that they required a more proactive approach to management. The fire shifted public opinion, leading to a greater emphasis on fire prevention and a recognition of the need for more research into wildfire behavior and ecology. As the years passed, the legacy of the Great Fire of 1910 continued to shape forest management policies, with the lessons learned from the disaster influencing how the U.S. Forest Service responded to future wildfires. The fire left behind a scarred landscape, but it also sparked a transformation in how the nation approached conservation, fire management, and the preservation of its natural resources. The legacy of the flames lives on today in the policies, practices, and values that guide the protection of America's forests and wilderness areas. Cementing Roosevelt's conservation legacy. The Great Fire of 1910, while devastating in its destruction, also served to solidify Theodore Roosevelt's legacy as one of America's most influential conservationists. By the time the fire had been brought under control, the landscape had been altered forever, and the nation had learned painful lessons about the limits of unchecked development. Roosevelt's vision for the conservation of America's natural resources, which he had worked to establish during his presidency, would endure as one of his most enduring legacies. The aftermath of the fire accelerated efforts to strengthen conservation practices and solidified the federal government's role in protecting public lands. Roosevelt's commitment to conservation began long before the Big Burn. He had made conservation a cornerstone of his presidency, creating national parks, national monuments, and the U.S. Forest Service. Under his leadership, the federal government began to take a more active role in protecting the nation's natural resources, setting aside millions of acres of forest land for future generations. Roosevelt's efforts were not solely focused on preserving wilderness for aesthetic reasons. He also recognized that conserving natural resources was critical to the nation's economic and social well-being. He understood that forests, watersheds, and wildlife habitats were vital for agriculture, water supply, and the economy as a whole. His establishment of the Forest Service and the creation of national parks would ensure that the nation's public lands were preserved and responsibly managed. While Roosevelt's conservation efforts were already groundbreaking, the fire and its aftermath underscored the need for more robust policies and systems. In the wake of the disaster, the U.S. Forest Service was forced to reevaluate its approach to wildfire prevention and forest management. The fire exposed the limitations of the existing firefighting tactics and led to reforms in how the government approached fire management. The lessons learned from the Big Burn would guide the Forest Service for decades to come, and the agency's evolving strategies for managing the nation's forests would reflect Roosevelt's initial vision for sustainable land management. Roosevelt's conservation legacy also extended beyond the fire itself. The public's heightened awareness of the fragility of the nation's natural resources in the aftermath of the Big Burn created a groundswell of support for additional conservation measures. The fire served as a catalyst for greater federal involvement in land management and protection, leading to the establishment of more national parks and wildlife refuges. Roosevelt's policies and ideas set the stage for future conservation efforts, influencing the work of future presidents, policymakers, and environmentalists. In the years following Roosevelt's presidency, his conservation legacy would continue to shape the direction of American environmental policy. The fires of 1910 underscored the importance of maintaining and managing public lands, ensuring that Roosevelt's vision of land stewardship and sustainable use would be central to America's approach to conservation for years to come. His influence remains felt in the modern environmental movement, where the principles he established continue to guide the nation's efforts to protect its natural resources. Lasting impact on fire management. The Great Fire of 1910 marked a pivotal moment in the history of wildfire management in the United States, leaving behind a lasting impact on how the U.S. Forest Service and other agencies approach the protection of public lands. Prior to the fire, wildfire management was still in its infancy, and the methods employed were largely reactive. The fire's catastrophic scale revealed the inadequacies of existing firefighting tactics and forced a complete rethinking of how to manage, prevent, and fight wildfires. The lessons learned from the Big Burn would shape fire management policies for decades and establish new standards in wildfire control. One of the most significant changes in fire management was the shift toward a more proactive approach. Before the Big Burn, fires were often allowed to burn themselves out or were fought only when they threatened populated areas. The fire of 1910, however, demonstrated the dangers of this passive strategy. The vast destruction it caused highlighted the need for better planning, preparation, and the development of specialized firefighting techniques. In the wake of the fire, the U.S. Forest Service began to focus more heavily on fire prevention, including the establishment of fire breaks, controlled burns, and more effective methods for detecting and monitoring fires. This shift in focus helped reduce the risk of future fires and allowed for quicker responses when new fires broke out. The fire also led to the development of better firefighting tools and techniques. The use of fire breaks, strips of land cleared of vegetation to stop the spread of fire, became more widespread. The Forest Service began to refine its methods of fighting wildfires, including the use of dynamite to create fire breaks, the development of more sophisticated firefighting equipment, and the creation of better communication systems to coordinate efforts. These innovations, born out of necessity during the fire, would later become standard practices in wildfire management across the country. Another lasting impact was the growth of fire management as a specialized field within the Forest Service. The Big Burn exposed the need for well-trained personnel dedicated solely to fire control and prevention. As a result, the Forest Service began to hire more trained firefighters and created specialized fire teams to handle large-scale fires. Firefighting became a year-round priority, with a focus on building a workforce that could respond quickly and effectively to emergencies. The fire also left an enduring legacy in terms of public awareness of the dangers of wildfires. The destruction caused by the Big Burn sparked a nationwide conversation about forest management and fire safety. Over time, this led to the establishment of public education campaigns aimed at reducing human-caused fires, as well as the development of better fire insurance policies for communities in wildfire-prone areas. In the long run, the lessons learned from the Great Fire of 1910 transformed wildfire management in the United States. The fire not only changed the way the Forest Service operated, but also set the stage for future innovations in fire prevention, training, and response, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to shape wildfire management today.